My father threw me out of my childhood home in the middle of a thunderstorm, laughing that I would be homeless within a week. He thought he had won. He thought he had finally secured the family empire and erased me from the picture. He had no idea that 24 hours later, he would be on his knees in front of me begging for mercy while my billionaire husband, who he did not even know existed, watched with a cold smile. My name is Simone, and I am 35 years old. If you think you know what betrayal feels like, wait until you hear what my own flesh and blood did to me for money. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family that underestimated your worth. The humidity in Atlanta was suffocating that afternoon, but it was nothing compared to the stifling atmosphere inside the Gilded Oak. This was my grandmother Beatrice's favorite restaurant, a place where the waiters wore white gloves and the steaks cost more than my weekly grocery budget. We were there for the repast, the meal following her funeral, but looking around the private dining room, you would have thought it was a networking event. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the mahogany tables, but I felt nothing but a deep, bone-chilling cold. My grandmother, the woman who had built Bee's Crown Cosmetics from a kitchen recipe into a billion-dollar empire, was gone. And I was the only person in the room who seemed to be actually mourning her. I adjusted the strap of my black dress, a simple piece I had bought off the rack, because I refused to charge a designer gown to the company card like my sister Tiffany. I took a deep breath and walked toward the head table. It was set for the immediate family. My seat should have been there next to my father. But as I approached, a hand shot out and blocked my path. It was Brad, my sister's husband. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my car, and he had that tight, condescending smile plastered on his face, the one he reserved specifically for me. "Excuse me, Simone." Brad said, his voice loud enough to carry over the low hum of conversation. "This table is for the executors and future board members. We need to discuss strategy for the transition. I think you would be more comfortable at one of the overflow tables in the back." I froze. The disrespect was palpable. I looked past him at my sister Tiffany, who was busy checking her makeup in her compact mirror, and then at my father Reginald. My father was sipping a glass of bourbon that probably cost $200 a shot. He saw what was happening. He saw his son-in-law blocking his eldest daughter from the family table, and he did absolutely nothing. He just swirled the amber liquid in his glass and looked away. "Brad," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "this is my grandmother's funeral repast. I am her granddaughter. I am sitting with my family." Brad chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. "Look, Simone, we all know you loved the old lady. That is sweet, really. But let's be realistic. You are an archivist. You organize dusty papers for a living. The conversation at this table is going to be about asset liquidation and stock splits. It is grown-up talk. We don't want to bore you. Now run along. There is a seat next to your grandmother's second cousin, twice removed, near the kitchen." My blood boiled beneath my skin, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of a scene. Not today. Not when Grandma B hadn't even been in the ground for 3 hours. I turned my head and locked eyes with my father again. "Dad, are you really going to let him do this?" Reginald finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, but not from crying. I knew that look. It was the look of a man who was already calculating how fast he could cash out. He set his glass down on the white tablecloth with a heavy thud. "Listen to Brad Simone. He is just trying to keep things organized. You have always been overly emotional. We need clear heads at this table. Just go sit in the back. And stop making everything about you. Overly emotional." That was their code word for me. Whenever I pointed out their greed, their selfishness, or their cruelty, I was just being emotional. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Fine." I turned around and walked to the back of the room, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. I could feel the eyes of the other guests on me. The whispers, the pity. I sat down at a small table near the swinging kitchen doors. The waiter poured me a glass of water and looked at me with sympathetic eyes. I didn't want his sympathy. I wanted justice. I watched from a distance as my family feasted. They ordered the seafood towers, the wagyu beef, bottles of vintage wine that were older than I was. They laughed. They toasted. My father held court, shaking hands with business associates, playing the role of the grieving heir perfectly. Tiffany was snapping photos of her food for Instagram, probably captioning them with something about heartbreak while shoving caviar into her mouth. 2 hours later, the room began to clear out. I stood up, exhausted, just wanting to go home to my small apartment, and finally let myself cry. I walked toward the exit, passing the main table. My father waved a hand, summoning me over like a servant. "Simone, wait!" he barked. I stopped. "What is it, Dad?" He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a leather folder. The bill. He tossed it across the table. It slid across the starched white cloth and landed right in front of me, knocking over a crystal salt shaker. "Take care of this," he said, returning his attention to his bourbon. I stared at the black folder. "Excuse me? You heard me?" He snapped, his voice turning sharp. "You sat here for 3 hours. You ate the food. You drank the water. You think this is a charity event, Dad?" I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I had a glass of water and a bread roll. You guys ordered $5,000 worth of wine. Brad ordered the surf and turf for the entire table. And who do you think paid for your college degree?" My father stood up now, looming over me. "Who do you think put a roof over your head for 18 years? You have never contributed a dime to this family business. You went off to work at that museum, playing with history, while we did the hard work of running a company. Consider this your contribution." I looked at the bill. My breath hitched. $15,240. "Dad, I don't have this kind of money," I whispered. "You know how much I make. Not my problem." He sneered. "You want to be part of this family? You pay your dues. I am not supporting freeloaders anymore. Beatrice coddled you, but she is gone now. There is a new sheriff in town. Pay the bill, Simone. Or don't bother showing up for the will reading tomorrow." Brad snickered behind his hand. Tiffany rolled her eyes and typed something on her phone. They were enjoying this. They were enjoying watching me squirm. I looked at my father's face. There was no love there, only contempt. He wanted to break me. He wanted to remind me that without him, I was nothing. He wanted me to beg. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so hot, it felt like it was burning a hole through my chest. I opened my banking app. I had been saving for 3 years to put a down payment on a small condo. It was my freedom fund. I looked at the balance. $16,000. Almost every penny I had to my name. I looked up at my father. "One last time. Are you sure about this?" "Dad, pay it," he spat. I didn't say another word. I tapped the screen. I transferred the funds to the restaurant's payment portal, which was printed on the QR code of the bill. Face ID confirmed. Processing. Approved. My balance dropped to $412. I held up the phone so he could see the green check mark. "It is paid," I said, my voice dead calm. "Good," he grunted, adjusting his silk tie. "See? That wasn't so hard. Maybe there is hope for you yet. Now go home. You look like a mess." He turned his back on me. Brad and Tiffany followed him out the door, laughing about something Brad had said. They left me standing there alone in the empty dining room, with a $400 balance and a broken heart. But as I turned to leave, my phone buzzed in my hand. I thought it was a transaction alert from the bank. It wasn't. It was a text message. From Mr. Henderson, my grandmother's personal attorney. The preview on the screen was short, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Simone, please come to my office immediately. Do not tell your father. We need to talk about what Beatrice really left you." I stared at the screen. Outside, thunder rumbled, shaking the window panes. A storm was coming. But my family had no idea that the real storm was standing right there in the room, clutching an iPhone ready to burn their whole world down. I walked out into the rain, and for the first time that day, I didn't feel cold. I felt ready. The next morning, the sky over Atlanta was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of more rain. It matched the knot of dread tightening in my stomach as I parked my 10-year-old sedan in the underground garage of Henderson and Wright. This law firm had represented my grandmother for 40 years. It was a fortress of mahogany and marble, a place where fortunes were built and destroyed with the stroke of a pen. I arrived 15 minutes early hoping to compose myself, but my hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. I kept replaying the events of the previous night, the humiliation at the restaurant, the $15,000 bill, the coldness in my father's eyes. I told myself that today would be the end of it. I expected to be cut out of the will entirely, or perhaps left a token amount just so they could say they gave me something. I was prepared to walk away and never look back. I had no idea that I was walking into an ambush, but I wasn't the target. I took the elevator up to the 42nd floor. The reception area was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock. When the heavy double doors opened, I saw them, my family. They had arrived even earlier than I had, fueled by greed and the anticipation of a massive payday. My father, Reginald, was lounging in a leather armchair, looking like a king waiting for his coronation. He was wearing a custom navy suit that I knew cost more than my annual salary. Next to him, my sister Tiffany was scrolling through her phone, her acrylic nails clicking against the screen. She was wearing a black dress that was far too short for a legal proceeding, but perfectly cut to show off her figure. And then there was Brad, my brother-in-law. He was pacing by the window, talking in a hushed, urgent tone into his cell phone. I stood in the doorway for a moment, invisible to them. "I am telling you the market is hot," Brad was whispering into the phone. "Once the old lady's assets clear probate, we can list the Buckhead property by Monday. I have a developer from Dubai interested in the land. We are talking 8 figures easy. Just have the paperwork ready." He hung up and turned around, finally noticing me. His face twisted into that familiar smirk. "Well, look who decided to show up," Brad said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did your check bounce yet, Simone? Or did you have to sell that junk car of yours to cover the bill?" My father didn't even look up from the file he was reading. "Ignore her, Brad. She is just here to beg. Let's get this over with so we can go celebrate. I have a table reserved at Bones for lunch." I walked past them without a word and took a seat in the corner as far away from them as possible. A few minutes later, the doors to the inner office opened, and Mr. Henderson stepped out. He was a tall man in his 70s, with hair as white as cotton and eyes that could see right through you. He had always been kind to me, often slipping me candy when I was a child, waiting for my grandmother to finish her meetings. Today, however, his face was stone. He carried a thick leather binder in his hands. "Please come in," Mr. Henderson said, his voice grave. We filed into the conference room. It was dominated by a long table that could seat 20 people. My father immediately took the chair at the head of the table, the one usually reserved for the presiding partner. Mr. Henderson didn't correct him. He simply sat at the opposite end, adjusted his glasses, and opened the binder. "I will skip the legal preambles." Mr. Henderson began, looking over the rim of his spectacles. Beatrice was very clear about her wishes. She updated this will 3 days before her passing. My father stiffened. "Updated? I didn't authorize any updates. I have power of attorney." Mr. Henderson looked at him coldly. "Your power of attorney applied to medical decisions, Reginald, not her estate." Beatrice was of sound mind until the very end, and she had a lot to say. He began to read. The first 20 minutes were standard: bequests to longtime staff members, donations to the Atlanta History Center, funding for a new wing at Spelman College. My father tapped his fingers impatiently on the table. Yes, charity is wonderful," Reginald interrupted, checking his gold Rolex. "Can we get to the main assets? The company, the properties. We have a board meeting scheduled for 2 o'clock. Mr. Henderson paused. He looked at my father for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he turned the page. To my son Reginald. Mr. Henderson read, his voice steady. You have spent your life waiting for me to die so you could step out of my shadow. You have treated my company as your personal piggy bank, and my family as your audience. I leave you my antique grandfather clock, the one that stands in the foyer of the manor. It stopped ticking years ago, just like your contribution to this family. May it remind you that your time is up. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. My father blinked. He let out a nervous laugh. Is this a joke? A clock? Where is the voting stock? Where is the CEO title? Mr. Henderson ignored him and turned to Tiffany. To my granddaughter Tiffany, he continued. You have always admired the finer things in life, often at the expense of your character. I leave you my entire collection of vintage Hermes and Chanel handbags. They are beautiful, empty containers. I hope one day you realize that you cannot live inside them and they cannot love you back. Tiffany gasped. She looked at Brad, confused. Wait, just the bags? What about the vacation house in Martha's Vineyard? What about the trust fund? Grandma promised me the vineyard house for my 30th birthday. Brad stopped pacing. His face went pale. Hold on. If Reginald doesn't get the company, and Tiffany doesn't get the real estate, who gets it? There are $20 billion in assets sitting on the table. Who gets it? Mr. Henderson turned the page one last time. He looked at me. His expression softened just for a fraction of a second before hardening again as he addressed the room. To my granddaughter Simone. All three heads snapped toward me. My father looked at me with pure disgust. Her, he spat. She is a librarian. What are you going to give her? The book collection. Mr. Henderson raised his voice, cutting over my father's insults. To Simone, the only one who sat by my bedside when I was sick, not to ask for money, but to hold my hand. The only one who respects the legacy I built, not just the profits it generates. I leave the entirety of the Beatrice Crown Trust. This includes 100% of the controlling stock in B's Crown Cosmetics, the complete real estate portfolio including the manor in Buckhead, the vacation properties in France, and Martha's Vineyard, and the diversified investment accounts. The total value of these assets is estimated at $20 billion. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt physical. I sat there, frozen, my hands gripping the armrests of my chair. 20 billion. The number didn't even make sense in my head. I looked at Mr. Henderson, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to say there was a mistake. But he simply closed the binder and placed his hands on top of it. Additionally, Mr. Henderson said, Simone is named the sole executor of the estate and the new chairwoman of the board, effective immediately. My father made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a scream. He stood up so abruptly that his heavy leather chair flew backward and crashed into the wall. You lying snake! Reginald roared, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He pointed a shaking finger at Mr. Henderson. You forged this. She is senile. She would never give my company to this failure. He turned on me. I saw a flash of violence in his eyes that I hadn't seen since I was a child. He lunged across the table, knocking over a pitcher of water. You manipulated her. Reginald screamed, grabbing the lapels of my blazer. You poisoned her mind against me. You ungrateful little witch. Give it back. Sign it over to me right now. I was too shocked to move. His spit hit my face. His hands were shaking me, his grip painful on my shoulders. Brad was shouting something about legal precedents. Tiffany was screaming. Suddenly, two large men in dark suits burst into the room. They were the firm's security, and they didn't hesitate. One of them grabbed my father by the back of his expensive suit jacket and yanked him off me. Get your hands off her! The guard shouted, pinning my father's arms behind his back. Reginald struggled, kicking and thrashing like a trapped animal. I built that company. It is mine. It is my birthright. Mr. Henderson stood up, calm and composed. He pressed a button on the intercom. Please escort Mr. Brooks and his guests out of the building. and notify the police if they attempt to return. Brad tried to step in using his best salesman voice. Now, wait a minute, let's all calm down. There has obviously been a misunderstanding. Simone, honey, tell them to let your father go. We can discuss this like family. We can split it. We can work something out. I stood up. My legs were shaking, but my voice was surprisingly steady. I looked at Brad, then at Tiffany, and finally at my father, who was panting heavily in the grip of the security guard. I wiped my father's spit off my cheek. There is nothing to discuss, I said. Get out. Reginald stopped struggling. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a hatred so pure it chilled my blood. He stopped shouting. His voice dropped to a low, venomous hiss that echoed in the large room. You think you have won, Simone. You think you can just take what is mine. The security guards began to drag him toward the door. He didn't fight them anymore. He just kept his eyes locked on mine. I will bury you in lawsuits, he snarled. I will drag your name through the mud until you can't get a job sweeping floors. I will take every penny back, and when I am done you will wish you had died with that old woman. The doors slammed shut, cutting off his voice, but the echo of his threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I stood alone in the center of the conference room, the sole heir to a $20 billion empire, and realized that the war had just begun. I drove back to my childhood home in a daze, the wipers of my 10-year-old sedan fighting a losing battle against the torrent of rain that had unleashed itself over Atlanta. The drive usually took 30 minutes, but today it felt like an eternity. Every stoplight gave me too much time to think, too much time to replay the look of pure hatred on my father's face. I was now technically one of the wealthiest women in the country, but as I turned onto the tree-lined street where I had grown up, I felt like a trespasser. The house was a sprawling colonial estate, sitting high on a hill with a manicured lawn that was now turning into a swamp under the deluge. It was the house where I had learned to ride a bike, where I had cried over teenage heartbreaks, and where I had spent years trying to be the daughter Reginald Brooks wanted. I pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching on the wet gravel. I just wanted to get into my room, pack my things, and leave. I wanted to disappear into a hotel for a few days until the reality of my inheritance settled in. I parked the car and ran through the rain to the front porch, shielding my head with my purse. I fumbled for my keys, my fingers slippery and cold. I found the brass key, the one I had carried on my keychain since I was 16, and slid it into the lock. It didn't turn. I frowned, wiggling it, thinking maybe it was just stuck. I tried again, harder this time. Nothing. It wouldn't budge. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I pulled the key out and looked at it, then looked at the lock. It looked shiny, new. My heart hammered against my ribs. They couldn't have. It had only been an hour. I rang the doorbell, once, twice. Then I started pounding on the solid oak wood. I knew they were inside. I could see the lights on in the foyer. I could see the shadow of movement behind the frosted glass. Open the door, I shouted over the sound of the thunder. Dad, I know you are in there. Let me in to get my things. The door swung open so abruptly that I almost fell forward. My father stood there. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. He was in his shirt sleeves, a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked at me, not as a daughter, but as a pest he had been waiting to exterminate. Behind him, the foyer was empty. No Tiffany, no Brad. Just him and a pile of luggage near the door. My luggage. You don't live here anymore, Reginald said, his voice slurring slightly. This is private property. Dad, stop this, I said, water dripping from my hair into my eyes. I just want my clothes. I want my laptop. Let me get my things and I will leave. He laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. Your things. You don't own anything, Simone. You are a thief. You stole my company. You stole my legacy. You think you can just walk back in here and sleep in my house after what you did? He set his glass down on the console table and grabbed the handle of the largest suitcase. It was my vintage leather trunk, the one Grandma Beatrice had given me for graduation. He dragged it to the threshold. You want your stuff? Here. He shoved the heavy trunk with all his strength. It tumbled down the 3 brick steps of the porch and landed with a sickening splash in a puddle of muddy water. The latch popped open on impact, spilling my clothes onto the wet driveway. My silk blouses, my work blazers, my journals all soaking up the brown sludge. "Dad, no!" I screamed, lunging forward to try and save them. He didn't stop. He grabbed 2 cardboard boxes next. My books, my personal files. He threw them out into the rain like he was taking out the trash. The cardboard immediately began to dissolve, my papers scattering in the wind. "This is what you are to me now," Reginald shouted, his face twisted in rage. "Garbage. You are garbage, Simone. You think a piece of paper makes you powerful. You are nothing without me." I fell to my knees frantically, trying to gather my clothes, trying to shove them back into the suitcase. Mud was coating my hands. The rain was soaking through my dress, chilling me to the bone. I looked up at him, tears finally mixing with the rain on my face. "Why do you hate me so much?" I choked out. "What did I ever do but try to make you proud?" He looked down at me with cold, dead eyes. "You were born," he said. "That was your first mistake." Before I could process the cruelty of those words, a shadow appeared behind him. It was Brad. My brother-in-law was leaning against the doorframe, picking his teeth with a toothpick. He looked amused. He looked at the mess on the driveway, then at me shivering in the mud, and smiled. "Rough day, huh, Simone?" Brad drawled. He stepped out onto the porch, staying under the shelter of the overhang. He jingled something in his pocket. By the way, he said, his voice casual. "We were going over the company assets. You know, since you are so concerned with proper ownership now." He pulled a set of keys out of his pocket. "My spare car keys." "That sedan you are driving," Brad said, pointing to my car parked in the driveway. "We checked the records. It is leased under the subsidiary of B's Crown. Technically, it is a fleet vehicle." I stood up slowly, wiping the mud from my hands onto my wet dress. "That is my car, Brad. I have made the payments on the lease for 5 years. It is just under the company plan for the insurance discount." "Technicalities," Brad said, waving a hand dismissively. "The point is, the lease is in the company name, and since your father is currently the acting CEO until the courts say otherwise, he has decided to revoke your vehicle privileges. We can't have a disgruntled former employee driving company property. Liability issues, you understand." He held out his hand. "Give me the keys, Simone." "You have got to be kidding me," I said, my voice rising. "It is pouring rain. I have nowhere to go." Brad stopped smiling. His face went hard. He stepped off the porch, towering over me. He was a big man, and for the first time I felt physically threatened. "I said, give me the keys," he growled. "Or do I have to call the cops and report a stolen vehicle?" Imagine how that would look. The new heiress arrested for grand theft auto on her first day. The press would love it. I looked at my father. He was just watching, sipping his drink again. He wasn't going to stop him. He wanted this. He wanted to strip me of everything until I was naked and helpless. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keys. I didn't hand them to Brad. I threw them as hard as I could into the bushes near the garage. "Fetch," I whispered. Brad's face turned red. "You little—" He lunged for me, but I stepped back. "Get off my property!" Reginald shouted from the door. "If you are not gone in 2 minutes, I am calling the police for trespassing." I looked at them one last time. My father, the man I had worshipped as a little girl. Brad, the man who had married my sister for her money. They were small. They were terrified. And they were dangerous. I grabbed the handle of my soaking wet suitcase. I left the boxes of books. I left the ruined papers. I turned my back on the house that had been my prison for 35 years. I started walking. The driveway was long, winding down the hill toward the main gate. The rain was relentless, stinging my skin like needles. My heels sank into the soft asphalt. My suitcase dragged behind me, heavy with water. I was shivering so hard my teeth chattered, but a fire was starting to burn inside my chest. It was a cold fire, a fire that consumed fear and left only clarity. I reached the iron gates at the bottom of the hill. I pushed the pedestrian exit button, and the heavy gate creaked open. I stepped out onto the public sidewalk. I was alone. I had no car, no home. My clothes were ruined. I looked like a homeless person. A car drove past, splashing water onto my legs, and didn't stop. I walked to the bus stop shelter a few yards down the road. It offered little protection, but it was better than nothing. I sat on the cold metal bench and pulled my phone out of my bra, where I had tucked it to keep it dry. My fingers were numb as I dialed the number. I had saved it under a fake name. Pizza delivery. It rang once. Simone. The voice on the other end was deep, warm, and instantly alert. "Why are you calling me on this line? Is everything okay?" I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. A sob escaped my throat, but I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle it. I needed to be strong. "Julian," I said, my voice cracking. "Where are you?" he asked immediately. "I can hear the rain. Are you outside?" "I am at the bus stop near my father's house," I said. "He threw me out. He took the car." There was a silence on the other end. A silence that was more terrifying than my father's screaming. It was the silence of a predator who had just spotted prey. "I am coming to get you," Julian said. His voice was low, deadly calm. "I will be there in 20 minutes. And then I am going to go up to that house, and—" "No," I interrupted. "No, Julian. You can't." "What do you mean, I can't?" "They hurt you, Simone. I am going to tear that house down brick by brick." "No," I said firmly, sitting up straighter. "Not yet. If you show up now, if the world sees Julian Thorne, the tech billionaire, picking up Reginald Brooks's daughter from a bus stop, it changes the narrative. They will say, I am just a gold digger. They will say I manipulated the will because I had a rich boyfriend backing me." "I don't care what they say," Julian argued. "You are my wife. You are cold and you are on the street." "I know," I said, watching the rain create rivers in the gutter. "And I love you for wanting to save me. But I don't want to be saved, Julian. I want to win." I took a deep breath. "If we want to beat them, we have to play this perfectly. They think I am weak. They think I am broken. They think I am walking to a motel right now to cry myself to sleep. Let them think that. Let them think they have won the battle." "So what do you want me to do?" Julian asked. "Come get me," I said. "Take me to the manor. Grandma left it to me. It is empty. The staff doesn't know who I am yet. I want to go there. I want to disappear for tonight. And tomorrow. Tomorrow we go to war. But I need you to stay in the shadows for a little longer. Can you do that for me?" There was a pause. I could hear him breathing. I could imagine him pacing in his office, looking out at the skyline, his fists clenched. 20 minutes, Julian said. "Look for the black SUV. And Simone." "Yes. I am going to make them pay for every drop of rain that touched you tonight." He hung up. I lowered the phone and looked back up the hill toward the house. The lights were still on. They were probably celebrating. They were probably pouring another drink, laughing about how pathetic I looked, dragging my suitcase in the mud. "Laugh while you can, Dad," I whispered into the storm. "Because you just evicted your daughter, but you just invited your worst nightmare to the door." I pulled my wet blazer tighter around me and waited for the black car that would carry me to my new life. The black SUV glided through the iron gates of the manor as if entering a different dimension. The storm that had raged outside, soaking my clothes and drowning my spirit, seemed to lose its power the moment we crossed the property line. Julian reached over and squeezed my hand, his grip warm and steady. I looked out the tinted window. I had visited my grandmother here 1,000 times, but tonight, seeing the limestone facade illuminated by floodlights, it looked different. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a fortress. It was a kingdom. And against all odds, I was its queen. As the car pulled up to the main entrance, I expected silence. I expected a dark house. Instead, the massive double doors were thrown wide open. Light spilled out onto the driveway, reflecting off the wet pavement like liquid gold. We stopped. The driver opened my door. I stepped out, still shivering slightly in my damp clothes. but I straightened my spine. Julian stepped out beside me, placing a protective hand on the small of my back. What I saw next took my breath away. Lined up on the front steps, standing in perfect formation, despite the late hour and the damp air, were 50 people. The household staff, maids in crisp black and white uniforms, groundskeepers, chefs, security personnel. At the front of the line stood Mr. Sterling, the head butler who had served my grandmother for 30 years. He was an imposing man with silver hair and posture that made military generals look slouchy. He stepped forward as I approached. He didn't look at my ruined shoes. He didn't look at my wet hair. He looked me straight in the eyes with a level of respect my own father had never shown me. "Welcome home," Madam Chairwoman Sterling said, his voice deep and resonant. He bowed his head slightly. Behind him, 50 people bowed in unison. It was a gesture of loyalty so profound that it made my throat tight. They weren't bowing to the money. They were bowing to the bloodline. They knew who I was. They knew I was the one who had sat with Beatrice in her final days while my father was out playing golf. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I managed to say, my voice steady. "I am sorry to wake everyone so late." "We have been awaiting your arrival," he replied smoothly. "Your grandmother left specific instructions for this transition. The house is yours, madame. Every room, every key, every secret." He gestured for us to enter. Walking into the foyer of the manor was like walking into a cathedral of wealth. The ceiling soared 30 feet high, dominated by a crystal chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of diamonds. But it wasn't the architecture that made you stop and stare. It was the art. My father had always bragged about his collection of prints and replicas, but Grandma B collected the real thing. Hanging on the wall to my right, casually illuminated by a soft museum light, was a Jean-Michel Basquiat. It was a chaotic, vibrant explosion of skulls and crowns painted with raw, aggressive strokes. I knew for a fact that this single painting had been appraised at $50 million last year. It was worth more than my father's entire life, and it was just hanging there in the hallway greeting me. Sterling led us through the main hall. We passed the wine cellar, a glass-encased room that held over 3,000 bottles. I saw a bottle of Domaine de la Romanée Conti from 1945 resting on a velvet pillow. That bottle alone could pay off the mortgage on my father's house. It was dizzying. The sheer scale of the resources now at my fingertips was enough to make anyone lightheaded. But we didn't stop to admire the wine. Sterling led us to a heavy oak door at the end of the corridor. He placed his hand on a biometric scanner on the wall. The panel beeped green and the door clicked open. "The Security Command Center," Sterling announced. Inside the room was a stark contrast to the old-world luxury of the rest of the house. It was a wall of screens. I saw live feeds from every corner of the estate, the gates, the gardens, the hallways. But then I saw something else. I saw feeds from the downtown headquarters of B's Crown Cosmetics. "Grandma liked to keep an eye on things," Sterling explained. "You have full access to the corporate servers from this room." I looked at Julian. He nodded. This was exactly what we needed. "I need a moment, Mr. Sterling," I said. "I need to go to her study. Alone." "Of course," Sterling said. "I will show Mr. Thorne to the drawing room and have some brandy poured." I left them and walked up the grand staircase. My footsteps were silent on the plush Persian runner. I reached the double doors of the master study on the second floor. I pushed them open. The room smelled like her. Lavender and old paper. It was comforting, but tonight I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for ammunition. Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, had whispered something to me before I left his office. He told me to look behind the portrait of my grandfather. I walked over to the oil painting above the fireplace. It depicted my grandfather, a stern man who had built the foundation of our wealth. I reached up and felt along the ornate gold frame. My fingers found a small latch. I pressed it. The painting swung forward on hidden hinges, revealing a heavy steel safe embedded in the wall. It wasn't a digital keypad. It was an old-fashioned dial combination, but underneath it was a small glass panel for a fingerprint. Grandma had made me register my fingerprint 3 years ago. At the time, she said it was just in case of emergencies. I realized now that she had been planning this war for a long time. I pressed my thumb against the glass. A mechanical whirring sound echoed in the quiet room. The heavy steel door popped open. Inside, there were no stacks of cash or gold bars. There were only stacks of leather-bound ledgers and a hard drive. I pulled out the top ledger. It was marked with my father's initials. RB Personal. I sat down at my grandmother's massive mahogany desk and opened the book. My hands started to shake as I turned the pages. These weren't official company records. These were the forensic accounting records Grandma had commissioned privately. I saw the dates. I saw the numbers. January 4th. Withdrawal of $200,000, labeled as marketing expenses. The actual destination was a shell company in the Cayman Islands. February 12th. Withdrawal of $500,000, labeled as vendor payment. Destination, the Bellagio Casino, Las Vegas. I flipped through the pages faster, my heart pounding in my chest. It went on for years. He had been bleeding the company dry. But then I saw the entry that made me stop breathing. Last month. Withdrawal of $5 million. I traced the line with my finger. The source of the funds wasn't the operating budget. It was the Bees Crown Children's Hospital Charity Fund. My father had stolen $5 million, meant for sick children to cover his gambling debts on stock futures. I felt a wave of nausea. I knew he was greedy. I knew he was selfish. But this was criminal. This was monstrous. He had stood at that gala last month, smiling for the cameras, talking about helping the community while he was funneling the donations into his own pocket to save his reputation. I reached into the safe and grabbed the hard drive. I knew what was on it. The digital trail, the bank transfers, the emails. I sat back in the chair, the leather creaking softly. The room felt cold, despite the fire that Sterling must have lit before I arrived. I looked up at the portrait of my grandfather, and then at the empty chair, where my grandmother used to sit. She knew. She knew he was a monster, and she had gathered the evidence piece by piece, waiting for me to be ready to use it. The door to the study opened quietly. Julian walked in. He had discarded his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. He looked at me, then at the open safe, then at the ledger open on the desk. He didn't ask if I was okay. He walked over and stood behind me, looking down at the numbers. He stole from the charity, I whispered, my voice sounding hollow in the large room. $5 million, Julian. He stole from kids with cancer. Julian placed his hands on the back of the chair, leaning down so his cheek was next to mine. Then we don't just take his money, Julian said, his voice dark and final. We take his freedom. I closed the ledger with a heavy thud. It sounded like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. I ran my hand over the leather cover. I wasn't the scared girl standing in the rain anymore. I wasn't the daughter begging for approval. I was the chairwoman, and I had just found the weapon that would end Reginald Brooks forever. I stood up, clutching the ledger to my chest. Mr. Sterling, I called out, pressing the intercom button on the desk. Yes, madam, his voice came back instantly. Prepare the guest suite for my husband, I said, looking at Julian. And Sterling, call the head of our legal team. Wake them up. Tell them to meet me here in 1 hour. We have a forensic audit to review. Very good, madam. I looked at the Basquiat painting on the far wall one last time. The crown in the painting seemed to glow. I walked out of the study, leaving the door to the safe wide open. There was no need to hide anything anymore. The truth was out, and it was going to burn my father's world to ash. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of the master suite, casting long beams of light across the Egyptian cotton sheets. For a brief second, between waking and remembering, I felt peace. I was in my grandmother's house, safe within the limestone walls of the manor. But the illusion shattered the moment I heard the low, rhythmic thumping sound coming from somewhere above the roof. It sounded like a war zone. I sat up, pushing the heavy duvet aside, and walked to the French doors that opened onto the balcony. I didn't step out. I just peered through the gap in the curtains. Hovering directly over the estate were two news helicopters, their cameras pointed down at the gardens like weapons. Below them, past the long, winding driveway and the iron gates, I could see a sea of vans and satellite dishes. The press had arrived. I turned away from the window just as the bedroom door opened. Julian walked in, fully dressed in a charcoal suit, holding a silver tray with coffee and a tablet. His face was grim. He set the tray down on the antique vanity and walked over to me, wrapping his arms around my waist. He didn't say good morning. He just held me tight, as if trying to physically shield me from what was happening outside. "Don't look at your phone," Julian said softly into my hair. "Just drink your coffee. Take a shower. Let me handle the noise." I pulled back slightly to look at him. "Julian there? Our helicopter's over the house. What is going on?" He sighed, running a hand over his trimmed beard. "It is Tiffany. She went live on Instagram about an hour ago. It is trending. Hashtag Justice for Grandma B is the #1 topic in the country right now." My stomach dropped. I walked over to the vanity and grabbed the tablet before he could stop me. I didn't have to search for it. It was everywhere. My sister's face filled the screen. She was sitting in her bedroom wearing no makeup, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She was wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt that made her look small and fragile. It was a costume. Tiffany wouldn't be caught dead without contouring even to check the mail. This was a performance. I pressed play. "Hey guys," Tiffany whispered to the camera, wiping away a tear that looked suspiciously well-timed. "I haven't been on here in a few days because, well, my family is going through a nightmare. You all know my grandmother passed away recently. We thought that was the worst part. But we were wrong." She paused, taking a shaky breath, looking directly into the lens. "I didn't want to say this. I wanted to protect my sister. But I can't stay silent anymore. Yesterday we found out that my sister Simone forced our grandmother to change her will 3 days before she died." I gripped the edge of the tablet so hard my knuckles turned white. Grandma was confused at the end. Tiffany continued, her voice trembling. "She didn't know who people were. I remember visiting her and she thought I was her sister from the 50s. But Simone was alone with her. She was giving her the medication. And I saw things. I saw Simone mixing things into Grandma's herbal tea. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I thought she was helping. But now that she has walked away with billions and cut the rest of us out, I have to wonder if my grandmother was even conscious when she signed those papers." The video cut to a black screen with white text, "Justice for Beatrice." I scrolled down to the comments. There were thousands of them, appearing so fast they were a blur. "That is elder abuse. Lock her up. Money brings out the devil in people. I always knew the quiet ones were the dangerous ones. Simone Brooks is a monster." 2 million views in 1 hour. I felt a cold numbness spreading through my limbs. It wasn't fear. It was shock at the sheer audacity of the lie. She was accusing me of poisoning the woman I loved more than anyone in the world. The woman I had bathed, fed, and read to while Tiffany was partying in Miami. I looked up at Julian. She is saying I drugged her. She is implying I killed her. "It gets worse," Julian said quietly. He took the tablet from my hand and swiped to a news app. There was my father. He was standing outside the gates of his house, the same house he had thrown me out of the night before. He was surrounded by microphones. He looked devastatingly handsome in a somber black suit, his eyes red-rimmed. He was playing the role of the grieving, betrayed patriarch to perfection. "My daughter Simone has always struggled," Reginald was saying to the reporters, his voice breaking with emotion. "We have tried to get her help for years. She has had episodes, paranoia, jealousy. She always felt overshadowed by the family's success. I never thought she would go this far. I never thought she would manipulate her dying grandmother. But mental illness is a tragedy. We are not angry. We are just worried. We just want the truth to come out so we can heal. He looked straight into the camera. Simone, if you are watching this, please. Just talk to us. We can fix this. You don't have to hide in that big house alone. I stared at the screen. It was a masterclass in manipulation. He had just painted me as mentally unstable, vindictive, and dangerous, all while pretending to be a concerned father. He was setting the stage for the conservatorship. If the world believed I was crazy, the courts would hand him the keys to the kingdom. I walked over to the window and closed the heavy velvet curtains blocking out the sun and the helicopters. The room plunged into semi-darkness. I need a drink, I said. It is 9 in the morning, Julian said. But he didn't argue. He walked to the minibar and poured a glass of sparkling water. I ignored it and walked out of the room. I walked barefoot down the grand hallway, past the Basquiat, past the portraits of ancestors who would be rolling in their graves if they saw this circus. I went straight to the security command center on the first floor. Mr. Sterling was already there, standing rigid by the wall of monitors. The room was humming with the sound of cooling fans and low chatter from the security team. When I entered, the chatter stopped. Every head turned to me. They had seen the news. They had seen the accusations. "Good morning, Madam Sterling," said his voice unwavering. "The perimeter is secure. We have requested police assistance to clear the paparazzi from the main road, but they are citing freedom of the press." I walked over to the main control desk and sat down in the leather chair. I looked at the screens. Screen 1 showed the mob outside the gate. Screen 2 showed the news feed of my father. Screen 3 showed Tiffany's Instagram, the view count now climbing to 2.5 million. "I am not crazy, Sterling," I said, looking at the monitor where my sister was fake crying. "We know," Madame Sterling replied instantly. "I was there when you made Mrs. Beatrice's tea. I saw you check the temperature on your wrist every single time to make sure it wasn't too hot. We all saw it." I looked at him, gratitude washing over me. But the world didn't see it. The world saw what my family wanted them to see. Julian entered the room behind me. He had a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir from the cellar and 2 crystal glasses. He poured a glass and set it down in front of me. "My legal team is on the line," Julian said, gesturing to the speakerphone on the desk. "We can issue a cease and desist. We can release a statement denying everything." I took a sip of the wine. It was rich and complex tasting of dark cherries and earth. It tasted like power. I watched my father on the screen, watched him wipe a fake tear from his cheek. "No," I said. "No statements." The lawyer on the speakerphone crackled to life. "Mrs. Thorne, with all due respect, silence will be interpreted as guilt. The narrative is spiraling out of control. They are destroying your character." "Let them," I said, leaning back in the chair. "Let them talk. Let them dig their grave a little deeper." I pointed to the screen showing Tiffany's video. "Is someone recording this?" I asked. "We are archiving everything," Madame the head of security replied. "Every tweet, every video, every interview." "Good," I said, "because every word they say is a lie, and every lie is a separate count of defamation." I swiveled the chair to face Julian. "My father said I have a history of mental illness. He said I have had episodes. That is a medical claim." "It is," Julian agreed, a small smile playing on his lips. "And Tiffany said she saw me putting things in the tea. That is a criminal accusation." I took another sip of wine, feeling the cold fire in my chest growing hotter. "Get the medical records from Grandma's doctors," I told the lawyer. "The toxicology reports were standard procedure when she passed, right?" "Yes," the lawyer confirmed. "The coroner's report was clean. Natural causes. No foreign substances. And get my employment records from the museum," I continued. 10 years of perfect performance reviews. No missed days. No mental breakdowns." I looked back at the wall of screens. The crowd outside was getting bigger. Someone had thrown a rock at the gate. "They think this is a reality show," I said softly. "They think they are the stars." I stood up and walked over to the monitor showing the live feed of the front gate. I placed my hand on the screen covering my father's face. Save it all, I commanded. Every second of it. I want high-resolution copies. I want transcripts, because when we walk into that courtroom, I am not going to argue with them. I am going to play their own words back to them while the jury watches. I turned to Sterling. Is the tunnel operational, I asked? The tunnel. Sterling blinked. The service tunnel that leads to the rear delivery entrance on the next street over, yes, madame. It hasn't been used in years, but it is clear. Good, I said. My father thinks I am hiding in here cowering in fear. He thinks I am trapped. I finished the wine in one swallow and set the glass down on the console with a sharp click. Prepare the car, Sterling. Not the limo. The black SUV with the tinted windows. And call the tailor. I need a suit. A white one. Where are we going? Julian asked, his eyes lighting up. I smiled, and for the first time in 2 days, it was a genuine smile. My father is giving a press conference at noon, isn't he? I said, checking the ticker on the news channel. Yes, Julian said slowly. Well, I said, smoothing down my hair. It would be rude not to join him. If he wants to talk about family, let's talk about family. But let's do it face to face while the cameras are rolling. The room went silent. The security team looked at each other. They realized that the woman in the silk pajamas wasn't a victim. She was a predator who had just finished playing dead. Julian walked over and kissed my forehead. I will drive, he said. I looked back at the screen one last time. Tiffany was still crying. My father was still shaking hands with reporters. They had no idea that the unstable daughter was coming for them, and she was bringing the receipts. Save the footage, I repeated to the security team. Save every single frame. Because this is the evidence that is going to cost them $20 billion. The crisp white suit I had just put on felt like armor, but even the finest tailoring in Atlanta could not protect me from the flashing blue lights now reflecting off the limestone walls of the manor. I had expected reporters. I had expected shouting. I had not expected the Fulton County Sheriff's Department. From the window of the security room, I watched as 2 deputies stepped out of a patrol car. They were not there to control the crowd. They were walking toward the front gate with a purpose that made the hair on my arms stand up. They were coming for me. Mr. Sterling stood beside me, his face pale but his posture rigid. Do not open the gate, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. Ask them what they want through the intercom. Sterling pressed the button. This is private property. State your business. The deputy looked directly into the camera. We have a court order for Simone Brooks. We need her to step outside to accept service, or we will be forced to enter. A court order. My father had moved faster than I thought. I looked at Julian, who was already on the phone with our legal team, his jaw tight. Let them in, Julian said, covering the mouthpiece. If you make them break down the gate, it plays right into their narrative. They want footage of you resisting. They want you to look out of control. I nodded. I knew he was right. Open it, Sterling. I walked to the front door, my heels clicking on the marble floor. I could feel the cold fire in my chest expanding. They were trying to humiliate me in my own home. They were trying to make me feel small. But as I pulled open the heavy double doors, I did not feel small. I felt dangerous. The deputies looked surprised to see me standing there, composed and dressed for a board meeting. They had probably been told to expect a hysterical woman throwing vases. One of them, a heavy-set man with a kindly face, stepped forward and handed me a thick stack of papers. Ms. Brooks, I am sorry to disturb you, he said, his eyes darting to the luxury cars in the driveway. We are serving you with an emergency petition for temporary conservatorship filed by your father, Reginald Brooks. I took the papers. They felt heavy in my hand. I did not look at the deputies. I looked down at the first page. The legal jargon was dense, but the meaning was clear. Petitioner alleges that the respondent Simone Brooks is suffering from an acute manic episode, characterized by delusions of grandeur, financial recklessness, and detachment from reality. I flipped the page. There was a sworn affidavit from a doctor. Dr. Anthony Vance. I have never heard of this man, I said, looking up. Who is Dr. Anthony Vance? The deputy shifted his weight. The paperwork says he has been your treating psychiatrist for 5 years, ma'am. He claims you stopped taking your medication 3 days ago, which precipitated this crisis. I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. I have never seen a psychiatrist in my life. I have never taken medication. This man is lying. The deputy looked uncomfortable. That is for the judge to decide, Ms. Brooks. There is an emergency hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. Until then, you are not to leave the jurisdiction or liquidate any assets. If you miss the hearing, a warrant will be issued for your detainment for a 72-hour psychiatric hold. They were not just trying to take the money. They were trying to take my mind. They wanted to lock me away in a facility, drug me until I was drooling, and then sign the checks with my limp hand. It was the most terrifying violation imaginable. I understand, officer, I said, my voice steady. Thank you for doing your job. You can leave now. I waited until the taillights of the patrol car disappeared down the driveway before I let the mask slip. I walked back into the house and threw the papers onto the antique console table. They slid across the polished wood and knocked over a vase of white lilies. Dr. Anthony Vance, Julian said, picking up the papers. He is a concierge doctor for the Buckhead elite. He specializes in discretion. Basically, he writes prescriptions for bored housewives and covers up overdoses for their husbands. He is a gun for hire. And Brad hired him, I said. My father does not know how to find a man like that. My father thinks therapy is for weak people. This has Brad's fingerprints all over it. I paced the length of the foyer. Brad, my brother-in-law, the man who smiled at me at Thanksgiving dinner while making jokes about my salary, the man who treated my sister like a trophy and my father like a bank. He was the architect of this. Reginald was the face because he was the father, but Brad was the one pulling the strings. He was the one desperate enough to risk a felony fraud charge because he needed access to the liquid cash in the estate. Why, I asked out loud. Why is he so desperate? I know he is greedy, but this is reckless. Faking medical records is a prison sentence if he gets caught. He is panicking. Why? Julian was already typing on his laptop. I told you I had my team run a background check on everyone. Brad calls himself a real estate developer, but he is really just a house flipper with a gambling problem. He is leveraged to the hilt. Julian turned the screen toward me. Look at this. He has 4 luxury flips sitting on the market right now. Interest rates went up and nobody is buying. He took out hard money loans to finance the renovations. High-interest short-term loans. And the balloon payments are due. He tapped a key. Next week. I stared at the screen. The numbers were staggering. Brad owed $12 million to a private lender. If he did not pay by next Friday, he would lose everything: his own house, his cars, his reputation. That is why he needs the conservatorship, I realized. He needs to raid the trust fund to pay off his loans before the house of cards collapses. He does not care about my mental health. He just needs a piggy bank. I looked at the name of the lender on the screen. Sovereign Capital Trust. Is that a bank? I asked. It is a boutique private equity firm, Julian said. Small, aggressive. They specialize in high-risk lending. I walked over to the window. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray. I looked at the crowd of reporters outside. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the crazy heiress to give them a show. Brad wants to play games with my life, I whispered. He wants to question my sanity. Let's see how sane he feels when the ground falls out from under him. I turned to Julian. The cold fire in my chest had turned into a blazing inferno. Buy it, I said. Julian blinked. Buy what? Sovereign Capital Trust, I said, pointing to the screen. Buy the bank. Buy the debt. Buy the whole damn company if you have to. I want to own every single cent that Brad owes. Julian's eyes widened. Simone, that is a mid-sized firm. It will cost— I have $20 billion, I cut him off, And you have even more. I don't care what it costs. I want to be the one holding the leash when his payment comes due. Julian stared at me for a long moment. Then a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He pulled out his phone. "This is going to be fun," he said. He dialed a number. "Get the acquisition team on the line." "Yes, now. I am looking at a distressed asset. Sovereign capital. I want a controlling stake purchased by end of day. Use the shell companies. No one can know it is us." I listened to him issuing orders, his voice commanding and precise. I walked back to the console table and picked up the fake medical report. Dr. Anthony Vance claimed I was delusional. He claimed I was detached from reality. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I smoothed the lapel of my white suit. I had never been more grounded in reality in my life. "Plan B is active," I said to my reflection. Brad thought he was hunting a sheep. He had no idea he had just cornered a wolf. Sterling appeared in the doorway. "Madame, the car is ready for the press conference. Are you sure you still want to go? The deputies serving the papers? The optics?" I turned to him. "The optics are perfect, Sterling. My father told the world I am sick. He told the world I am hiding. If I don't show up, I prove him right." I walked toward the door. "But I am not going there to defend myself," I said. "I am going there to introduce them to the new chairwoman." I stepped out onto the front porch. The humidity hit me, but I didn't flinch. I saw the wall of paparazzi turn their lenses toward me. I saw the flashes explode like lightning. I put on my sunglasses. "Let's go to war," I whispered. As the SUV rolled down the driveway, I looked at the papers one last time before shredding them. Tomorrow I would deal with the judge. But today I was going to deal with the family. Brad wanted to control my assets. Fine, I was about to become his biggest creditor, and I was going to collect every penny with interest. The leather interior of the SUV was silent as we navigated the Atlanta traffic, but my mind was screaming. We were minutes away from the press conference where I planned to make my debut as the new chairwoman, but the war was being fought on multiple fronts. I watched the city blur past the tinted windows, skyscrapers, billboards. The world outside looked normal, but my world had tilted on its axis. Julian sat beside me, monitoring the acquisition of the bank that held Brad's debt. He looked calm, a general in his element. I tried to borrow some of his composure. I told myself that the worst was over. My family had thrown their hardest punch with the conservatorship filing. They had weaponized the police. They had weaponized my sister's social media. Surely they had run out of ammunition. I was wrong. My phone vibrated against my thigh. It was a news alert from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I usually ignored them, but the headline made my blood run cold. It did not mention my father. It did not mention Tiffany. It mentioned the one person outside of this car that I trusted with my life. Exclusive. Childhood best friend of heiress Simone Brooks speaks out. Confirms mental health struggles. I felt the air leave my lungs. No, not her. Anyone but her. I tapped the link with trembling fingers. A video player loaded. There, sitting in a studio chair with perfect lighting, was Monique. Monique, who I had shared a dorm room with in college. Monique, who had held my hair back when I got food poisoning on spring break. Monique, who knew every secret, every insecurity, every scar my family had inflicted on me. She looked sad. She looked reluctant. It was a perfect performance. "I love Simone like a sister," Monique said to the interviewer, wiping a delicate tear from her cheek. "That is why this is so hard for me. But I cannot sit back and watch her destroy herself." The interviewer leaned in. "So you agree with her father's assessment? Do you believe she is experiencing a break from reality?" Monique sighed, looking down at her hands. "Simone has always lived in a fantasy world. She has always been fragile. She used to call me late at night talking about how the walls were closing in on her. She has always been jealous of her sister Tiffany. It became an obsession, really. She would say things like, 'I should be the one on the magazine covers. I should be the one with the trust fund.'" "Liar," I whispered at the screen. My voice was so tight it hurt. Liar. I never wanted the fame. I never wanted Tiffany's life. I just wanted to be seen. Monique continued, her voice gaining confidence. When I heard she changed the will, I was not surprised. Simone has a way of twisting reality to fit her narrative. She probably believes she deserves that money, but she is not well. She needs help. She needs her father to step in and take control before she hurts herself or someone else. The video ended. I dropped the phone. It slid off the leather seat and hit the floor mat with a thud. I stared straight ahead, my vision blurring. This pain was different from what I felt with my father. My father had always been a monster. I expected his cruelty. But Monique was my sanctuary. She was the one person who told me I was sane when my family tried to gaslight me. To hear my own vulnerabilities, my private fears twisted and weaponized against me by the person who was supposed to protect them felt like a physical knife in the gut. Julian picked up the phone. He watched the video, his face darkening with every second. He did not say a word. He just started typing on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. "Check her accounts," I said. My voice sounded dead even to my own ears. "I am already doing it," Julian replied, his voice low and dangerous. I knew my father. He did not have friends, he had transactions. He did not inspire loyalty, he purchased it. If Monique was sitting in that chair saying those words, there was a price tag attached to it. "Here it is," Julian said, stopping typing. He turned the laptop toward me. I looked at the screen. It was a bank transfer record obtained through the forensic access we had to the family accounts. Yesterday afternoon at 4:30 p.m., a wire transfer from Reginald Brooks's personal shell company. Destination: the Monique Daniels small business account. The amount: $50,000. I laughed. A bitter, jagged sound that scratched my throat. $50,000. That was the price of our friendship. That was the cost of 15 years of secrets. My father had bought my reputation for the price of a luxury car, and Monique had sold me out to save her failing boutique. She was struggling, I said, staring at the number. She told me last week that rent was due, and she didn't know if she could make payroll. I told her I would help her once the estate settled. I told her I would be there for her. She didn't want to wait, Julian said softly. He offered a cash injection now. She took the sure thing. I reached for my phone. I dialed Monique's number. "Simone, don't," Julian warned. "I have to hear her say it," I said. The phone rang 3 times. Then she picked up. "Simone." Her voice was shaky. "Look, I know you saw it." "Why?" I asked. Just one word. "Why?" Silence on the other end. Then a sigh. A heavy, resigned sigh. "He offered to clear my business loans, Simone. He offered to pay off my student debt. Do you know what that means for me? I was drowning. You have billions now. You will be fine. You can hire the best lawyers. You can fight them. But I was going to lose everything. So you decided to help them take my freedom." I said, my voice trembling with rage. "You decided to help them lock me up in a psych ward. You know I am not crazy, Monique. You know exactly what they did to me growing up." "I know," Monique whispered. "I am sorry, Simone. It is just business. I had to choose myself. It is just business." The same words my father used when he threw me out. The same words Brad used when he tried to take my car. I took a deep breath. The tears that had been threatening to fall evaporated. The heat in my chest returned hotter than before. It burned away the sadness. It burned away the betrayal. It left only clarity. "You are right, Monique," I said, my voice turning into ice. "It is just business. And you just made a very bad business decision." I hung up. I blocked the number. I deleted her contact. I looked at Julian. "Is the bank acquisition complete?" I asked. He looked at me, assessing my state. He saw the shift. He saw the girl who wanted to be loved disappear and the woman who wanted to win take her place. "We close in 10 minutes, Julian said. "We will own Sovereign Capital Trust by the time we reach the press conference." "Good," I said. "And Monique's business loan." Who holds that note? Julian typed for a second. It is a small business administration loan serviced by, well, would you look at that? It is serviced by a subsidiary of Sovereign Capital. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was a shark smile. So once we buy the bank, we own her debt too, I said. Technically, yes, Julian said. We could call it in. We could foreclose on her inventory. Do it, I said, immediately. I want her shop boarded up by tomorrow morning. I want her to realize that $50,000 from my father does not cover the cost of betraying me. Julian nodded. Consider it done. I looked out the window again. We were pulling up to the venue. The crowd was massive. I could see the satellite trucks. I could see the posters my father's team had printed with his face on them. I felt a strange sense of peace. The last tether to my old life had just been severed. Monique was the last piece of the old Simone, the weak Simone who needed validation. Now, I had no one left to lose. I had no one left to protect. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The white suit was spotless. My makeup was flawless. My eyes were dry. They took my mother from me, I whispered to the glass. They took my home. They took my best friend. They think they have isolated me. I turned to Julian. They forgot one thing I said. What is that? He asked, kissing my hand. They forgot that I am the one holding the checkbook now, I said. The car stopped. The security team opened the doors. The flashbulbs exploded, blinding and relentless. I stepped out into the chaos, not as a victim, but as a tyrant in the making. My father was inside, probably rehearsing his speech about his poor, sick daughter. He had no idea that his poor, sick daughter had just authorized the purchase of his destruction. I walked up the steps toward the entrance. Every click of my heels was a countdown. The betrayal hurt, yes. It felt like an amputation. But I realized something as I walked through those doors. You do not need friends when you have an empire, and you do not need loyalty when you have leverage. I was done looking for love. I was looking for liquidation, and today everyone was going to pay. My phone sat on the marble kitchen island, vibrating with a persistence that demanded attention. The screen flashed a name I had not expected to see so soon. Dad. I stared at it for a long moment, letting it buzz against the cold stone. Julian stood by the espresso machine, watching me over the rim of his cup. He did not say anything. He knew that whatever happened next had to be my decision. I picked up the phone and swiped to answer, putting it on speaker so Julian could hear. "Hello, Dad," I said, my voice neutral. "Simone, honey." The voice that floated out of the speaker was not the snarling beast who had thrown me out into the rain. It was not the weeping victim I had seen on the news. It was the smooth, charming baritone of Reginald Brooks, the philanthropist, the pillar of the community. It was the voice he used when he wanted to close a deal. "I have been doing a lot of thinking since yesterday," he continued. "I was angry. You were angry. We both said things we did not mean. The police coming to the house. That was a misunderstanding. Brad got carried away. You know how protective he is. I listened to the lie. It was so smooth, so practiced. He was rewriting history while the ink was still wet. I just want my daughter back, Simone. I want us to be a family again. Your mother would not want us fighting over money. It is just paper, right? Blood is what matters." I looked at Julian. He rolled his eyes and made a gagging motion. I suppressed a smirk. "What do you want, Dad?" I asked. "I want you to come home for dinner tonight," he said. "Just a quiet family dinner. Me, you, Tiffany, and Brad. Let's sit down, break bread, and figure this out. I have a proposal that I think will make everyone happy. I am ready to forgive you, Simone. I am ready to welcome you back. Forgive me." The audacity was breathtaking. He had stolen millions from charity. He had tried to have me committed to a psych ward. And now he was offering me forgiveness. "That sounds interesting," I said. "Interesting, I." "What time?" 7 o'clock, he said quickly. "Don't be late. And Simone, come alone. We don't need lawyers involved in a family dinner." I hung up. The silence in the kitchen was heavy. He is lying, Julian said, setting his cup down. Of course he is lying, I replied, walking over to the window that overlooked the estate grounds. He does not want a family dinner, he wants a surrender ceremony. I walked over to the security console in the corner of the room. I pulled up the live feed from the hidden cameras we still had access to inside my father's house. The cameras Grandma B had installed years ago to keep an eye on the staff but never told anyone about. I zoomed in on the dining room. There were caterers setting up, not for a dinner for four. There were 3 round tables. I switched to the living room camera. There were lighting rigs being set up, microphones. I zoomed in on a clipboard sitting on the coffee table. I could read the guest list, the board of directors of B's Crown, the senior partners of the law firm, and at the bottom of the list, highlighted in yellow, the editorial board of the Atlanta Business Chronicle and a camera crew from CNN. He is not inviting me to dinner, I said, pointing at the screen. He is inviting me to a public execution. He is going to ambush me with the board and the press. He is going to put a settlement agreement in front of me and pressure me to sign it while the cameras are rolling so he can look like the benevolent patriarch saving his unstable daughter. Julian stepped up behind me and looked at the screen. So we don't go, he said. We stay here. We let him host a dinner for an empty chair. No, I said, turning around. If I don't go, he wins the narrative. He will tell the press I am too unstable to show up. He will say I am hiding. I walked toward the master bedroom. I am going, I said, but I am not going as the daughter he forgave. I am going as the chairwoman he fears. I walked into the massive walk-in closet. It was larger than my old apartment. Rows of designer clothes that Grandma B had bought over the years lined the walls. But I didn't want vintage. I wanted something that screamed the future. I reached for a garment bag that had been delivered that morning from a private showroom in Paris. I unzipped it. Inside was a suit that cost more than my first car. It was a structured blazer with sharp, exaggerated shoulders tailored to within a millimeter of my life. The fabric was a deep midnight blue, almost black, woven with subtle metallic threads that caught the light like armor. I put it on. It fit like a second skin. I added a diamond choker that felt cold and heavy against my throat. I pulled my hair back into a severe, sleek bun. I applied a dark red lipstick. When I walked out into the hallway, Julian was waiting. He was wearing a tuxedo. I thought he said, "Come alone," he said, smiling. He did, I replied. But since when do I listen to him? We walked down to the garage. The fleet of cars was impressive, but tonight required a statement. I walked past the Ferraris and the Mercedes. I stopped in front of the vehicle under the velvet tarp in the back corner. Grandma's Phantom, I whispered. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, custom built, two-tone silver and black. It was a tank wrapped in luxury. It was the car she used to take to hostile takeovers. Sterling pulled the tarp off. The Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament gleamed under the garage lights. Prepare the car, Sterling, I said, and tell the security team to follow in the escort vehicles. We are going to make an entrance. The drive to my father's house was smooth and silent. The Phantom floated over the potholes that my old sedan used to crash into. I sat in the back seat watching the familiar streets pass by. My heart should have been pounding. I should have been terrified. But I felt nothing but a cold, razor-sharp focus. We turned onto the street leading to the estate. As I expected, the street was lined with news vans. My father had leaked the reconciliation dinner to the press. They were waiting to catch a glimpse of the prodigal daughter returning to beg for forgiveness. When the massive silver grille of the Rolls-Royce came into view, the photographers went wild. Flashes exploded against the tinted glass. I didn't flinch. We pulled up to the gate, the same gate I had walked out of in the rain yesterday. The guard recognized the car. He looked confused, terrified even. He opened the gate immediately. We drove up the winding driveway. The rain had washed away the mud from yesterday, leaving the asphalt clean and black. When we reached the top of the hill, the house was blazing with light. The front door was open. I could see people inside. Suits, dresses, champagne glasses. "This is not a dinner party," Julian said from beside me. This is a coronation. For him, I said. Or so he thinks. The driver opened my door. The suicide doors of the Phantom swung wide. I stepped out. The gravel crunched under my heels. I didn't wait to be announced. I walked up the front steps, Julian a step behind me, looking like my royal guard. I walked through the open front door. The chatter in the foyer died instantly. My father was standing in the center of the room holding a glass of champagne, holding court with 3 members of the board. He looked up. His smile froze. He had expected a broken girl in jeans. He had expected red-rimmed eyes. Instead, he saw a woman in a $20,000 suit, wearing diamonds that cost more than his mortgage, standing tall and unbroken. He saw the Rolls-Royce in the driveway behind me. He saw Julian Thorne, the billionaire shark he owed money to, standing at my shoulder. The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. The reporters in the corner lowered their cameras for a second, stunned by the visual. "Hello, Dad," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. Reginald recovered quickly. He was a showman after all. He spread his arms wide, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Simone, you made it. And you brought a guest." He looked at Julian nervously. "Mr. Thorne, I didn't realize you were acquainted with my daughter." I walked past him, ignoring his open arms. I walked straight to the center of the room where the cameras were set up. I turned to face him. "Acquainted is one word for it," I said. I looked around the room. I made eye contact with the board members who had ignored me for years. I looked at the reporters who had printed his lies this morning. "You said you wanted a family dinner, Dad?" I said, gesturing to the crowd. "But this looks like a board meeting." Reginald chuckled a nervous sound. "Well, since everyone is here, I thought we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I have the papers drawn up, Simone. The settlement. It ensures you are taken care of for life. A monthly allowance, a nice house. All you have to do is sign over the voting rights to the company so the adults can get back to business." He gestured to a lawyer who stepped forward with a thick document and a gold pen. "Just sign it, honey," Reginald said, his voice dropping to that fake soothing tone. "Let's end this nightmare. Let's heal." I looked at the document. Then I looked at the camera crew. The red light was on. We were live. I took the document from the lawyer. My father exhaled. He thought he had won. He thought the pressure of the room, the cameras, the board would crush me. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at him. "You are right, Dad," I said. "We should end this nightmare." I ripped the document in half. The sound of the tearing paper was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Reginald's face turned purple. "What are you doing?" he hissed. I ripped it again and again, letting the pieces fall to the floor like confetti. "I am not here to sign your settlement, Dad," I said, my voice rising so everyone could hear. "I am here to accept your resignation." "Resignation?" he sputtered. "You are insane. You are sick." I smiled. And that is when I signaled Julian. He pulled a remote from his pocket and pointed it at the large television screen mounted above the fireplace, the one my father used to display his stock market wins. The screen flickered to life, but it wasn't stocks. It was a video, a grainy black and white video from a security camera. It showed a man sitting at a computer in the middle of the night transferring funds. It showed the timestamp. It showed the account numbers. Children's Hospital Charity Fund. The room gasped. "That is you, Dad," I said, pointing at the screen. "Stealing $5 million from kids with cancer to pay your gambling debts." Reginald lunged for the remote, but Julian stepped in front of him, blocking him with a wall of muscle. I turned back to the cameras. "My father called you here to witness me giving up," I said, "but I invited you here to witness the truth. Reginald Brooks is no longer the CEO of B's Crown. As the majority shareholder, I am removing him for cause. Effective immediately." I looked at the board members. Their faces were pale. They knew what this meant. They knew they had backed the wrong horse. And as for the rest of you, I said, my eyes sweeping over Tiffany and Brad, who were cowering in the corner. Get out of my house. My father stood shaking in the center of the room, surrounded by the torn paper of his failed scheme. The cameras were zooming in on his face, capturing every second of his ruin. The dinner was served, but it was cold revenge, and he was the only one choking on it. The heavy oak doors of my father's study clicked shut, cutting off the hum of the party and the blinding flashes of the cameras outside. The silence that followed was sudden and suffocating. This was the room where Reginald Brooks had played the role of the great patriarch for 30 years. The walls were lined with leather-bound books he had never read, and photos of him shaking hands with politicians who now wouldn't return his calls. But tonight, the room did not feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage, and I was the animal they had finally cornered. My father walked behind his massive mahogany desk and sat down the leather chair, groaning under his weight. He didn't look like the confident man who had greeted me in the foyer moments ago. His smile had vanished. In the harsh light of the desk lamp, I could see the sweat beading on his forehead and the tremor in his hands as he poured himself a drink. He didn't offer me one. Brad and Tiffany took their positions, flanking me. Brad leaned against the door, crossing his arms over his chest in a posture meant to be intimidating. Tiffany sat on the edge of the sofa, nervously picking at the sequins on her dress. They were closing ranks. The vultures were circling. So Reginald said, taking a long swallow of scotch, "Let's cut the theatrics, Simone. You made quite an entrance. The Rolls Royce. The suit. Very impressive. I assume you rented them to make a point." I stood in the center of the room, refusing to sit. I wanted to tower over him. "I don't rent, Dad," I said, my voice cool and detached. "And I didn't come here to talk about my wardrobe. You said you had a proposal." Reginald nodded, gesturing to Brad. Brad pushed off the doorframe and walked over to the desk. He picked up a thick blue folder and slid it across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of me. He looked at me with that same smug, arrogant grin that had made my skin crawl for years. "We are worried about you, Simone," Brad said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "This whole episode, the spending, the paranoia, the delusions of grandeur, it is classic bipolar behavior. Dr. Vance agrees with us. If this goes to court, the judge is going to see a woman who is a danger to herself." He tapped the folder with his index finger. "But we are family," he continued. "We don't want to drag you through the mud. We don't want to lock you up in a facility unless we absolutely have to. So we came up with a solution. A safety net." I looked down at the folder. Settlement agreement and voluntary conservatorship was printed on the cover in bold black letters. I opened it. I scanned the legal jargon. It was a masterclass in theft. Clause 1. Simone Brooks agrees to voluntarily relinquish all voting rights and board seats in B's Crown Cosmetics to Reginald Brooks due to medical incapacity. Clause 2. All liquid assets and real estate holdings currently in the name of Simone Brooks will be placed into a blind trust managed by Sovereign Capital. I paused. Sovereign Capital. The bank Brad owed millions to. The bank Julian and I had just bought an hour ago. They didn't know. They had no idea I was reading my own victory in their ransom note. I flipped to the financial terms. In exchange for this voluntary cooperation, the trust agrees to provide Simone Brooks with a monthly maintenance stipend of $5,000 and a lump sum payment of $1 million upon signing. I looked up. I looked at my father, who was watching me with hungry, desperate eyes. I looked at Tiffany, who was trying to look bored but was watching my hands intently. $1 million, I said, keeping my face blank. "It is a lot of money," Tiffany chimed in, her voice shrill. "You could buy a nice condo. You could travel. You wouldn't have to work at that dusty museum anymore. You could finally be happy." "Happy," I repeated. "You think $1 million makes me happy?" "It is more than you have ever earned in your life," Brad snapped, his patience fraying. "Look, let's be real. You are not a CEO. You are a librarian. You don't know how to run a billion-dollar empire. You will run it into the ground in a week. We are doing you a favor. We are taking the burden off your shoulders. My father leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. Sign the papers, Simone, he said, his voice low. Sign them, and the police go away. The medical reports go away. We tell the press you are taking a leave of absence to focus on your health. You get to keep your dignity. And if I don't? I asked, closing the folder. Reginald's face hardened. The mask of the loving father slipped completely, revealing the predator underneath. Then we release the full file from Dr. Vance, he said. We release the videos of you shouting at staff. We have witnesses, Simone. We have affidavits. By tomorrow morning, you won't be the chairwoman. You will be a patient in the state psychiatric ward on a 72-hour hold. And when you get out, if you get out, we will sue you for elder abuse. We will make sure you end up with nothing, not even that $1,000,000. The room was silent. The threat hung in the air, heavy and toxic. They had planned this perfectly. They had the fake doctor. They had the fake witnesses. They had the media waiting outside to broadcast my downfall. They thought they had boxed me in. I looked at the folder again. $1,000,000. It was an insult. It was a crumb thrown to a starving dog. But to them it was generosity. Because they didn't see me as a person. They saw me as an obstacle. I reached into my pocket. I saw their eyes widen. They thought I was reaching for a pen. Brad stepped closer, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his jacket pocket and held it out to me. Here, he said, smiling. Use this. It is the pen I used to sign the deal for my first development. It is good luck. I looked at the pen. Then I looked at Brad. I reached out and took it. The tension in the room broke. My father let out a long breath he had been holding. Tiffany clapped her hands together softly. They thought they had won. They thought the scared little girl was back doing what she was told to save her skin. I held the pen over the signature line. I could feel their greed radiating off them like heat. They were already spending the money in their heads. They were already planning the victory party. I looked at the tip of the pen hovering over the paper. You know, I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. Grandma B told me once that the only time you should sign a contract is when you are the one holding the gun. Reginald frowned. What did you say? I stood up straight. I didn't look at the paper anymore. I looked directly at my father. I said I looked at the pen, twirling it in my fingers. This is a nice pen, Brad. It is a shame you are going to lose it when the bank repossesses your personal assets next week. Brad froze. What are you talking about? And Dad, I continued, turning to him, that $1,000,000 you are offering me, is that coming from the company accounts? Or is it coming from the $5 million you stole from the Children's Hospital Charity Fund? Reginald's face went white. He stood up, knocking his chair over. How do you know about that? He whispered. I smiled. And for the first time they saw it. They saw the cold fire. They saw the wolf. I didn't sign the paper. Instead, I snapped the gold pen in half. Ink exploded over my hands and onto the white carpet, staining it like black blood. I dropped the broken pieces onto the settlement agreement. You think I am trapped in here with you? I said, my voice rising, filling the room. You think you have me cornered. You think because I am a woman, because I am quiet, because I am your daughter, that I am weak. I took a step toward them, and they actually took a step back. You checked my bank accounts. You checked my medical records. But you forgot to check the one thing that matters. You forgot to check who was standing in the shadows. I walked to the double doors of the study. I placed my hand on the handle. You offered me $1,000,000 to go away, I said, looking back at them one last time. I am going to spend $20 million just to watch you burn. Simone, Reginald shouted, coming around the desk. You can't leave. The police are on their way. You are not walking out of this room. I threw the doors open. The party noise flooded back in. The cameras were waiting. The guests were waiting. I turned back to my family, my face calm, my eyes deadly. You are right, Dad. I am not walking out of here. Not alone. I looked past them toward the foyer, where a tall figure in a tuxedo had just stepped through the front entrance, pushing past the security guards. "Did you really think I came here alone?" I asked. And then I stepped aside and let the devil walk in. The heavy double doors of the study did not just open, they burst inward as if hit by a battering ram. The sound echoed off the wood paneling, causing everyone in the room to jump. My father spun around, his face flushed with rage, ready to scream at whatever security guard had failed to do his job. But the scream died in his throat. It was replaced by a look of absolute bewildered terror that slowly morphed into a pathetic, desperate hope. Framed in the doorway stood 4 men. They were not the rented mall cops my father employed. These men were giants wearing earpieces and bespoke suits that struggled to contain their bulk. They stepped into the room with synchronized precision, clearing a path like a phalanx of Roman soldiers. They pushed the reporters back. They pushed the board members back. They created a wide, empty lane right down the center of the Persian rug. And then he walked in. Julian Thorne. He was wearing a tuxedo that was cut so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. The black velvet lapels absorbed the light, while the diamond studs on his shirt flashed with every step. He did not walk like a guest. He walked like he owned the building, the land it sat on, and the air everyone was breathing. His expression was bored, almost predatory, as he scanned the room, ignoring the cameras that had instinctively turned toward him. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens when a predator enters a clearing. Even the flashbulbs stopped popping for a second. Then came the sound of breaking glass. Reginald Brooks, my father, the man who had been screaming at me seconds ago, dropped his crystal tumbler of scotch. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered, spraying amber liquid and shards of glass over his polished Italian shoes. He didn't even notice. He was staring at Julian with his mouth hanging open. For 6 months, my father had been trying to get a meeting with Julian. I knew this because I had seen the desperate emails in the company server. He had called Julian's office every day. He had sent gift baskets. He had practically camped out in the lobby of Thorn Tech. He needed Julian's capital to save B's crown from the hole he had dug. To my father, Julian Thorne was not a man, he was a mythical creature made of money. And now here he was standing in my father's study. My father's narcissism was a powerful drug. In that split second, his brain rewrote reality. He forgot that I was standing there defying him. He forgot the ripped settlement agreement. He forgot the police threats. He only saw his savior. "Mr. Thorne!" My father gasped, stepping over the broken glass. He smoothed his hair back with a trembling hand and buttoned his jacket, trying to regain some shred of dignity. He put on his best sales smile, a gruesome expression that looked like a rictus of fear and greed. "Mr. Thorne, I am honored. I knew you received my messages. I knew a man of your vision would see the potential in our partnership." Reginald walked toward Julian, his hand extended for a handshake. "You came to save me, didn't you?" my father said, his voice trembling with relief. "You came to finalize the investment. Thank God. You arrived just in time. We were just dealing with a small, family personnel issue." He gestured dismissively toward me as if I were a stain on the carpet. "My daughter is having a bit of a breakdown," my father whispered loudly, leaning in as if sharing a secret with a peer. "We were just about to have her escorted out. But now that you are here, we can talk business. I have the portfolio ready in the safe." Julian did not break stride. He did not look at my father's extended hand. He did not acknowledge my father's existence. He walked right through him. My father had to scramble backward to avoid being run over, stumbling into the edge of the desk. He looked confused, blinking rapidly as Julian swept past him like a dark storm cloud. Julian's eyes were locked on one thing: me. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. The crowd parted for him, terrified to even brush against his sleeve. Brad, who was standing next to me with his arms crossed, suddenly looked very small. He pressed his back against the bookshelf, his face draining of color. Brad knew who Julian was. Brad knew exactly whose name was on the loan documents he had signed. Julian stopped in front of me. The room held its breath. He looked me up and down, taking in the midnight blue suit, the diamond choker, the ink stains on my hands from the broken pen. His eyes softened. The cold mask of the billionaire shark fell away, and for a moment, he was just the man who made me coffee in the morning. He reached out and took my ink-stained hands in his. He didn't care about the mess. He brought them to his lips and kissed my knuckles gently one by one. Then he leaned in. He placed a hand on my waist, pulling me close until there was no space left between us. He kissed my forehead, a lingering, tender gesture that spoke of possession and protection. "Sorry I am late, darling," he said, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Traffic in Atlanta is a nightmare tonight. I tried to get the helicopter, but the storm grounded us." He pulled back slightly, looking into my eyes and smiling. "Are you okay, my love? Did they hurt you?" I smiled back, feeling the strength returning to my legs. "I am fine," I said softly. "Just taking out the trash." The sound of my father's voice shattered the moment. It was a strangled, high-pitched squeak. Darling Reginald was gripping the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. He looked from Julian to me and back again. His brain was misfiring, trying to process two incompatible facts. Julian Thorne was the most eligible bachelor in the country. Simone Brooks was the daughter he had called a failure. Did you just call her darling?" My father stammered. Julian finally turned to face him. He didn't let go of me. He kept his arm wrapped firmly around my waist, turning us as a unit to face the room. "I did," Julian said coolly. "Is there a problem with how I address my wife?" The word hung in the air. Wife. It hit the room like a physical blow. Tiffany gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth. She dropped her phone. It clattered on the floor, but she didn't move to pick it up. She was staring at Julian with a mix of horror and lust. She had a poster of this man on her wall in college. She had followed his every move in the tabloids. And he was married to her sister. The sister she called boring. The sister she mocked for staying home on Friday nights. Wife Reginald repeated the word, tasting it like poison. "No, that is impossible. Simone is single. She lives alone in a small apartment. She is a librarian." Julian laughed. It was a dark, dry sound. "She is an archivist," Julian corrected him, "and she is brilliant at it, which is why she was smart enough to keep our marriage private for 2 years. 2 years! Tiffany shrieked, stepping forward. "You have been married to him for 2 years, and you didn't tell us." Julian looked at Tiffany. His eyes were like ice. "Why would she tell you?" Julian asked. "So you could ask him for a loan. So you could try to sell the story to the tabloids. So you could use her to get to me." He tightened his grip on my waist. "We saw how you treat her." Julian continued, his voice rising with controlled anger. "We saw how you treat the people who love you. Simone wanted to protect me from you. She wanted to keep the one good thing in her life safe from your greed. And I agreed." Reginald sank into his chair. He looked like he was having a stroke. He was running the math in his head. If Simone was Julian Thorne's wife, then the power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had flipped upside down. So, my father whispered, his voice shaking, "So the bank accounts, the assets, are communal property," Julian finished for him. My father looked at me with new eyes. He didn't see his daughter anymore. He saw a direct line to billions of dollars. He saw a lifeline. "Oh, Simone," he breathed, standing up again, a manic smile returning to his face. This is wonderful news. Why didn't you say something?" "My little girl married to Julian Thorne. This changes everything." He walked around the desk, his arms open again. "Welcome to the family, son!" he boomed, trying to bluster his way through the shock. "This is a joyous occasion. We should be celebrating." I knew Simone had a secret, but I never guessed. He reached out to clap Julian on the shoulder. Julian caught his wrist. He didn't squeeze. He just held it there in midair, stopping my father cold. "Don't touch me," Julian said softly. My father froze. "And don't call me son," Julian continued. "You lost the right to claim any relation to this woman when you threw her out into the rain yesterday." "But," Reginald stammered, trying to pull his hand back. Julian held fast. "You invited the press here, Reginald," Julian said, gesturing to the cameras with his free hand. "You wanted a show. You wanted to expose Simone. Well, you got your wish." Julian released my father's wrist with a shove that sent him stumbling back. He turned to the cameras. The red lights were blinking. The reporters were leaning in, hungry for the scoop of the century. "My name is Julian Thorne," Julian announced, his voice commanding the room. "And I am here to make a statement." He looked at Brad, who was trying to slide toward the door. "Stay right there," Julian commanded. "We have business to discuss." Brad froze. Julian turned back to the room. "For the last 48 hours, this family has engaged in a systematic campaign to destroy the reputation of my wife, Simone Brooks. They have filed false police reports. They have falsified medical records. They have used the media to bully a woman they thought was defenseless." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "They did this because they wanted her money. They wanted the inheritance her grandmother left her. They thought if they broke her, she would sign it over." Julian looked at me. His eyes were full of pride, but they didn't know who she was, and they certainly didn't know who I was. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded document. It wasn't a settlement agreement. It was a single sheet of paper with a bank logo on the top. Sovereign Capital Trust. Brad let out a small whimpering sound. Reginald Brooks. My father looked at the paper. He didn't understand yet. He was still stuck on the marriage. "What is that?" Reginald asked. "This," Julian said, holding up the paper. "This is a notice of acquisition. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, Thorne Holdings has acquired a controlling interest in Sovereign Capital Trust." He turned to Brad. "That is the bank that holds the $12 million in loans you used to finance your unsold developments, Brad." Brad's knees gave out. He actually collapsed onto the sofa next to Tiffany, burying his head in his hands. And Julian continued, turning back to my father. "It is also the bank that services the variable rate mortgage on this house, Reginald, and the business loans for your private shell companies." My father's face went gray. "What? What does that mean?" Reginald whispered. "It means," Julian said, smiling a smile that did not reach his eyes. "It means I am not just your son-in-law. I am your landlord. I am your banker. And I am your debt collector." He dropped the paper onto the desk. It landed next to the ripped pieces of the settlement agreement. "And unlike you," Reginald, Julian said, "I don't negotiate with terrorists." I stepped forward, standing next to my husband. I looked at the cameras. "You wanted a story," I said to the reporters. "Here is your headline. The Brooks family just lost everything, and they didn't lose it to bad luck. They lost it because they bet against the wrong woman." I looked at my father, who was now slumped in his chair, looking small and defeated. "Dinner is served." "Dad," I said, "I hope you have an appetite. Because you are going to eat every single word you said about me." The silence in the study was no longer the silence of shock. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a courtroom before the gavel drops. My father was slumped in his chair, his face a mask of gray ash. Brad was huddled on the sofa, his head in his hands. Tiffany was staring at her phone, tapping the screen frantically as if she could reboot her reality. Julian stood by the fireplace, looking like a judge in a tuxedo. He held the remote control in his hand, not as a weapon, but as a gavel. I stood beside him, feeling the warmth of his presence against the chill of the room. I looked at the people who shared my DNA. They looked like strangers. They looked like small, frightened children who had broken a vase and were waiting for the punishment. But this wasn't a broken vase. This was a broken life. My life. And the punishment was going to be total. Julian pointed the remote at the large television screen mounted above the fireplace. The image of my father stealing from the charity fund disappeared. It was replaced by a complex spiderweb of spreadsheets and bank statements. The text was small, but on the massive 4K screen, every zero was visible. "Let's start with the head of the snake." Julian said, his voice calm and conversational. He pressed a button. The screen zoomed in on a document titled Promissory Note, Reginald Brooks. My father looked up. His eyes squinted against the harsh light of the screen. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "This," Julian said, "is the master loan agreement for B's Crown Cosmetics. You leverage the company assets to cover your personal losses in the futures market. You put up the factory as collateral. You put up the distribution centers. You even put up the intellectual property rights to the formulas." Julian walked over to the desk, leaning down so he was eye level with my father. "And here is the interesting part, Reginald. The loan covenants state that if the CEO is found to be engaged in criminal activity, the lender has the right to call the full balance of the loan immediately." My father swallowed hard. But that is with the bank. That is with Sovereign Capital. I can talk to them. I have a relationship with the VP. Julian smiled. It was a terrifying sight. "You had a relationship with him," Julian corrected. "But as of 4 o'clock today, I accepted the resignation of the entire executive board of Sovereign Capital. The new management team is very strict about compliance, and they have decided to call the loan." Julian pressed the remote again. A new number flashed on the screen in bright red. $85 million. "This is the total amount due," Julian said. "Payable immediately." My father made a sound like a dying animal. 85 million, I don't have that kind of liquidity. You know I don't. The stock is tied up. The houses are mortgaged. Exactly, Julian said, straightening up. "Which means you are in default. Which means as the new owner of the debt, I have the right to seize all collateral to satisfy the judgment." He pointed to the walls of the study. "I own this house, Reginald. I own the furniture you are sitting on. I own the car in the driveway. I own the watch on your wrist." My father instinctively covered his gold Rolex with his hand. "You can't do this," he stammered. "This is my home. I have lived here for 30 years. You have lived here on borrowed time," Julian said, cold as ice. "You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. Whatever you can carry in your car, you can keep. Everything else belongs to Thorn Holdings." Reginald looked at me. He looked at his daughter, begging for salvation. "Simone," he rasped. "Please, you can't let him do this. This is your childhood home." I looked at him. I remembered the rain. I remembered the mud on my hands. I remembered him throwing my suitcase down the steps. "It is just a building, Dad," I said, my voice empty of emotion. "You told me that yesterday. You said I was garbage. Well, I am taking out the trash." Reginald put his head on the desk and began to sob. It was a pathetic sound. The sound of a man who realized he wasn't the king, he was just the jester. Julian turned his attention to the sofa. "Tiffany," he said. My sister jumped. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. She was clutching her phone to her chest like a shield. "You have been very busy on social media," Julian said. 2 million views. That is impressive. You built quite a following based on the lie that your sister is mentally unstable and dangerous." Tiffany licked her lips. It was just my opinion," she stammered. "Freedom of speech. You can't sue me for having an opinion." "Defamation is not an opinion," Julian said, "especially when it causes material financial damage. But we decided not to sue you, Tiffany. Lawsuits take too long." He pressed the remote. The screen changed again. It showed a screenshot of Tiffany's TikTok profile. But instead of her usual grid of selfies and fashion hauls, there was a gray banner across the top. "Account permanently banned." Tiffany screamed. It was a high-pitched, piercing shriek that made everyone wince. She looked down at her phone, frantically refreshing the app. "No," she screamed. "No. It says login error. It says my account doesn't exist." We contacted the legal departments of TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube about an hour ago, Julian explained. We provided them with the toxicology reports proving Simone was never on drugs. We provided the affidavits proving your statements were knowingly false. And we reminded them that hosting libelous content makes them liable for damages. He shrugged. They were very cooperative. You have been deplatformed, Tiffany. Your IP address is banned. Your name is flagged. You will never be an influencer again. You are digitally extinct. My brand, Tiffany, wailed, tears streaming down her face, for real this time. I spent 5 years building that. That is my income. That is my life. Your life was built on destroying your sister, I said, stepping forward. You sold me out for likes, Tiffany. You monetized my pain. Now you can go find a real job. I hear the mall is hiring. Tiffany slumped back against the cushions, sobbing uncontrollably. She didn't care about the house. She didn't care about our father. She only cared that her audience was gone. She was invisible. And for a narcissist, that was a fate worse than death. Julian turned to the last person in the room. Brad, he said. Brad didn't look up. He was staring at the pattern on the rug, rocking back and forth slightly. Brad, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming deadly serious. You are the only one in this room who actually impressed me. Brad looked up slowly, hope flickering in his eyes. I did, he whispered. Yes, Julian said. Reginald is a thief. Tiffany is a liar. But you are a criminal mastermind, or at least you tried to be. The screen changed one last time. It showed a series of complex diagrams. Arrows pointed from construction accounts to offshore entities. We audited the books of your development company, Brad, Julian explained. We found the loans from Sovereign Capital, but we also found something else. We found the invoices for materials that were never purchased. We found the payments to contractors who don't exist. Julian pointed to a specific entry. $3 million for lumber for a house that hasn't even broken ground yet. And the lumber company. It is registered to a P.O. box in Panama that lists you as the beneficiary. Brad's face went from pale to a sickly green. That is standard industry practice, he choked out. It is tax optimization. No, Julian said. It is money laundering. You are taking loans from the bank, funneling the money into your own pockets through fake vendors, and then defaulting on the loans. It is called bank fraud, Brad. And because you used wire transfers to move the money, it is wire fraud. And because you did it across state lines, it is a federal crime. Brad stood up. His legs were shaking so hard they knocked together. I can fix it, he said, his voice rising in panic. I can pay it back. I will sell the land. I will sell my car. Just don't call the bank. I don't need to call the bank, Julian said. I own the bank. But there is someone else I did have to call. Julian walked over to the window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain. Look outside, Brad. Brad stumbled to the window. He looked out into the driveway. The flashing blue lights of the local police were gone. They had been replaced by black SUVs with government plates. Men in windbreakers with yellow letters on the back were standing by the front door talking to the security team. FBI, Julian said. Economic Crimes Division. They have been investigating Sovereign Capital's loan portfolio for months. When we bought the bank, we handed them your file as a gesture of goodwill. They are very eager to meet you. Brad made a sound like a strangled sob. He turned around looking for an exit. But there was no way out. The study door was blocked by Julian's security. The window led to a 2-story drop. Simone, Brad pleaded, looking at me with wild eyes. You can't let them take me. I am family. I am your brother-in-law. Think about Tiffany. Think about the embarrassment. I looked at him. I looked at the sweat dripping down his face. I looked at the man who had mocked me for years, who had tried to gaslight me into an asylum, who had tried to steal my inheritance to cover his crimes. You are not family, Brad, I said, my voice calm and final. You are a felon. And as for the embarrassment, I looked at the camera crew in the corner who had captured every single second of this. I think the world needs to see what happens to men who steal from women. I nodded to Julian. Julian pressed a button on his phone. The study doors opened. Two agents walked in. They didn't look at the luxury of the room. They walked straight to Brad. Bradley Jenkins, one of the agents said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. You are under arrest for bank fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Brad didn't fight. He collapsed. He let them pull his arms behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room. They dragged him out. He was weeping, calling Tiffany's name. But Tiffany didn't look up. She was still staring at her blank phone screen, mourning her follower count. I turned back to my father. He was still sitting at his desk, surrounded by the wreckage of his life. The bankruptcy, the eviction, the criminal exposure. It was all happening at once. He looked up at me. His eyes were empty. The arrogance was gone. The charm was gone. There was only an old, broken man who had gambled everything on his own ego and lost. Are you happy now, Simone? He whispered. Is this what you wanted? To destroy us? I walked over to the desk. I picked up the broken pieces of the gold pen I had snapped earlier. I placed them gently in front of him. I didn't destroy you, Dad, I said. I just turned on the lights. You destroyed yourselves in the dark a long time ago. I turned around and took Julian's arm. Let's go home, I said. We walked out of the study, leaving them in the ruins of their own making. I didn't look back. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel guilt. I felt the weight lifting off my shoulders, the weight of their expectations, the weight of their cruelty, the weight of their lies. It was all gone, and in its place was the clean, cold air of freedom. The sound of the handcuffs clicking around Brad's wrists echoed through the foyer, like a gunshot signaling the end of the war. He was weeping openly now, a messy, undignified sobbing that shook his entire frame. The FBI agents were not gentle. They hauled him up by his elbows, his expensive Italian loafers dragging across the hardwood floor he had so arrogantly walked upon just an hour ago. He twisted his head back, his eyes searching the room for a lifeline for anyone who would save him from the consequences of his own greed. Tiffany, he screamed, his voice cracking. Tiffany, do something. Tell them who I am. Call my lawyer. Don't let them take me. My sister stood frozen by the sofa, her face a mask of horrified self-preservation. She did not look at her husband. She did not step forward to comfort him. She looked at the federal agents, then at the cameras that were still rolling in the corner, and finally at Julian and me. I saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. She knew Brad was a sinking ship, and Tiffany had never been one to go down with the vessel. She took a step back, physically distancing herself from the man she had married for status. I don't know anything about his business, Tiffany stammered, addressing the room at large, but looking specifically at the agents. He handled all the finances. I was just a victim too. He lied to me. Brad stopped struggling. He stared at his wife, the woman he had committed fraud to impress the woman whose lifestyle he had stolen millions to maintain. The betrayal on his face was almost pitiable, but then I remembered the way he had laughed when he took my car keys in the rain. You cow! Brad spat, his voice filled with venom. You spent the money you knew. The agents pushed him through the front door. The last thing we heard was his voice fading into the night, screaming obscenities as they shoved him into the back of a government vehicle. The heavy door slammed shut, and a silence descended on the room, broken only by the soft whir of the air conditioning and my father's ragged breathing. Tiffany turned to me. The tears in her eyes were real now, born of terror rather than performance. She rushed forward, her hands reaching out to grab my arm, but Julian stepped in between us, his presence a solid wall of protection. Tiffany stopped short, her hands hovering in the air. Simone, please, she wailed, dropping to her knees. It was a dramatic gesture, one she had probably practiced for her followers, but this time the desperation was genuine. I didn't know he was doing illegal things. You have to believe me. I am your sister. We are blood. You can't let me lose everything. I have nowhere to go. My accounts are frozen. My platform is gone. I looked down at her. I saw the little girl who used to steal my toys and break them just to see me cry. I saw the teenager who spread rumors about me in high school. I saw the woman who had live-streamed lies about my mental health to millions of strangers just this morning. "Get up, Tiffany," I said, my voice cold and flat. "You are embarrassing yourself." She scrambled to her feet, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "You can help me," she pleaded. "You have billions now. Just a small loan. Just enough to get an apartment and start over. I will go away. I promise. I will never bother you again. Just give me a chance." I looked at Julian. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small business card. He handed it to Tiffany. "What is this?" she asked, her hands trembling as she took it. "It is the number for a staffing agency," I said. "They specialize in entry-level positions, retail, food service, cleaning. Honest work, Tiffany. It is time you learned what that feels like." "But," she gasped, staring at the card as if it were an insult. "I can't work in a restaurant. I am Tiffany Brooks." "Not anymore," I said. "Tiffany Brooks was an influencer. She was an heiress. You are just Tiffany now, and you are trespassing." I nodded to the security team. Two of Julian's guards stepped forward. "Escort her off the property," I ordered. "If she resists, call the police and add trespassing to her list of problems." Tiffany opened her mouth to scream, to curse, to beg, but she looked into my eyes and saw nothing but a mirror reflecting her own cruelty back at her. She realized finally that the well had run dry. She turned and walked out the door, flanked by the guards, stripped of her audience, her husband, and her dignity. Now there was only one left. I turned slowly to face the desk. My father was still sitting there, slumped in his leather chair, like a king whose throne had been turned into an electric chair. The fight had gone out of him. He looked old. The sharp lines of his face seemed to have sagged in the last hour. He was staring at the empty space where his future used to be. I walked over to the desk. The distance between us felt like miles spanned by years of neglect and emotional abuse. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a check. It was a brochure stapled to an admission form. I placed it gently on the desk in front of him, right on top of the mahogany surface he had banged his fist on so many times to intimidate me. "What is this?" Reginald whispered, his voice hoarse. He didn't look up. He just stared at the logo on the brochure. "Oak Creek Senior Living," I read aloud. "It is a facility about 2 hours south of here. It is state-subsidized. They have a bed available in the memory care wing." He looked up, then his eyes wide with shock. "A nursing home," he rasped. "You are putting me in a home. I am 60 years old, Simone. I am perfectly healthy. You can't do this." I leaned in, resting my hands on the desk. "Can't I?" I asked. "Yesterday you told the world I was mentally unstable. You told the police I was a danger to myself. You were ready to lock me away in a psychiatric ward against my will. I am just returning the favor, Dad. I am concerned about you." I tapped the paper. "I spoke to your doctors," I lied smoothly. "They agree that the stress of losing your company, your reputation, and your fortune might trigger a breakdown. You need supervision. You need structure." "I am not going," he shouted, trying to muster some of his old fire. "This is my house. You can't make me leave." I stood up and signaled to Julian. He pressed a button on the remote again. The screen above the fireplace changed. It showed a live feed of a tow truck in the driveway. A man was hooking chains to the bumper of my father's Mercedes. "The house," I said. "You don't have a house, Dad. Sovereign Capital foreclosed on this property 5 minutes ago. The deed has been transferred to Thorn Holdings. You are technically squatting." Reginald stared at the screen, watching his beloved car being hoisted into the air. "And the car," I continued. "That is company property. It is being repossessed to pay down a fraction of the $85 million you stole." He looked down at his wrist, at the gold Rolex. I held out my hand. "The watch, Dad," I said. He clutched his wrist, covering the gold band. No, no, please. Your mother gave me this. It is the only thing I have left. Mom gave that to the man she loved. I said, my voice unwavering. She didn't give it to a thief who stole from children. Give it to me, now, or I will have the marshals remove it. His lip quivered. A tear leaked out of his eye and tracked through the sweat on his cheek. Slowly, with shaking fingers, he unclasped the watch. He held it for a second, feeling the weight of the gold, the weight of his former life. Then he dropped it into my palm. It felt cold and heavy. And the ring, I said. He gasped. Simone. The ring, Reginald. It was bought with embezzled funds. It belongs to the estate. He pulled the diamond signet ring off his pinky finger. He placed it on the desk. He looked naked, without his jewelry. He looked small. I pocketed the items. The medical transport is waiting outside, I said. You can take one bag. I had the maid pack it for you. It has sweatpants, t-shirts, and toiletries. You won't need suits where you are going. Reginald looked around the room. He looked at the books, the paintings, the legacy he thought was his birthright. I am Reginald Brooks, he muttered, his eyes darting around the room frantically. I am the CEO. I have a meeting. I have a meeting with the board. His mind was snapping. The reality was too harsh, so he was retreating into a fantasy. They can't start without me, he mumbled, standing up and buttoning his jacket with trembling hands. I have the projections. I have the numbers. Tell them I am coming. I watched him. It was tragic in a way, but it was a tragedy he had written himself, line by line. Two men in white uniforms walked into the study. They carried no weapons, only a gentle, firm authority. They were from the private ambulance service I had hired. Mr. Brooks, one of the attendants said softly, "It is time to go." Reginald looked at them confused. He smiled a vacuous, empty smile. "Ah, my drivers," he said, nodding. "Take me to the airport. I have a flight to Paris. We are expanding the European division." The attendant looked at me. I nodded. "Yes, Dad," I said softly. "You are going on a long trip." They took him by the arms. He didn't fight. He walked between them, shuffling slightly, talking to the air. "We need to check the stock price," Reginald babbled as they led him out of the study. "Call Julian Thorne. Tell him I approve the merger. Tell him I am ready to sign." He walked past me without seeing me. He walked out of the house he had built on lies, leaving behind the daughter he had tried to destroy. I watched them lead him through the foyer, past the silent camera crew who were filming the final exit of the Atlanta King. He looked small in the doorway, a silhouette against the flashing lights of the ambulance. Then he was gone. The front door closed. The silence that followed was pure. It was clean. I stood in the center of the study. I was the last one standing. Brad was in cuffs. Tiffany was on the street. Reginald was in a home. Julian walked over to me. He didn't say anything. He just poured 2 glasses of the scotch my father had left on the sidebar. He handed one to me. "To justice?" Julian asked, raising his glass. I looked at the amber liquid. I looked at the broken pen on the desk. I looked at the empty chair. I clinked the glass against his. "To freedom," I whispered. I took a sip. It burned, but it was a good burn. It tasted like victory. The war was over. And for the first time in 35 years, the house was quiet, and I was finally truly home. 3 months later, the air inside the manor tasted different. It no longer smelled of old paper and suppressed secrets. It smelled of fresh white roses, expensive perfume, and the crisp electric charge of absolute power. Tonight was the inaugural gala for the Beatrice Brooks Foundation, a charity dedicated to financial literacy for underprivileged youth. But everyone in the room knew what tonight really was. It was my coronation. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, the same staircase I used to creep down silently as a child to avoid waking my father. My hand rested lightly on the polished mahogany banister. Below me, 500 of Atlanta's most influential people were milling about in the Great Hall. There were senators, tech moguls, artists, and the old money families who had ruled the city for generations. For years, these people had looked right through me. To them, I was just Reginald's quiet daughter, the one with the dusty job at the museum, the background character in my own life. Tonight, they were not looking through me. They were looking up at me. I was wearing a gown made of liquid emerald silk that draped over my body like a second skin commissioned from a designer in Milan, who usually only dressed royalty. Around my neck was the bee's crown diamond, a yellow diamond pendant that had been in the company vault for decades. My grandmother had never worn it, saying it was too ostentatious, but tonight required ostentation. It required a statement that could be seen from space. Julian stood beside me. He looked devastating in a white dinner jacket that contrasted perfectly with my dress. He didn't look like a bodyguard anymore, nor did he look like just a husband. He looked like the other half of the empire. He reached out and offered me his arm. "Are you ready, Madam Chairwoman?" he whispered, a playful glint in his dark eyes. I looked down at the sea of faces. I saw the faces of board members who had once voted to cut my department's budget. I saw the faces of women who had gossiped about my mental health when the scandal broke. I saw the faces of men who had enabled my father's gambling for years. "I am ready," I said. We began to descend. The moment my heel touched the first step, the conversation in the room died. It wasn't the terrified silence of the study 3 months ago. It was the reverent silence of a court acknowledging its queen. Every head turned. Every glass was lowered. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, the crowd parted. It was a physical manifestation of power. People stepped back to create a wide lane for us, eager to catch my eye, eager to be acknowledged. Simone, a woman in a red dress, stepped forward. It was Mrs. Gable, the head of this preservation society. She used to criticize my parking. "You look absolutely stunning tonight. We are so excited about the new direction of the company." "Thank you, Clarissa," I said, using her first name without asking. It was a subtle power move, and she beamed as if I had knighted her. Mr. Henderson, my grandmother's lawyer, was waiting by the champagne tower. He looked younger, lighter, as if the purging of the toxic elements in the company had given him a new lease on life. "Your grandmother would be proud, Simone," he said quietly, gripping my hand. "You have done more in 90 days than your father did in 30 years. The stock is up 40%. The new product line is sold out. You didn't just save the legacy, you evolved it." I smiled at him. "I didn't save it alone, Arthur. You gave me the map." I moved through the room, shaking hands, accepting compliments, and navigating the treacherous waters of high society with an ease that surprised even me. I realized then that I had always possessed this skill. I had just been told to hide it. My father had convinced me I was socially awkward because he needed to be the star. But a star cannot shine when it is being eclipsed, and now that the shadow was gone, I was blinding. Julian stayed by my side, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back. Occasionally he would lean in to whisper something that made me laugh, a private bubble of intimacy in a room full of sharks. About an hour into the evening, I needed a moment of air. I signaled to Julian, and we slipped out through the French doors onto the massive stone balcony that overlooked the estate grounds and the glittering skyline of Atlanta in the distance. The night air was cool and sweet. I walked to the edge of the balustrade and looked down at the driveway. It was filled with Bentleys and Rolls-Royces, a parking lot of unimaginable wealth. But my mind wasn't on the cars. It was on a specific image I had seen earlier that day. On the way to the salon this morning, my driver had taken a detour through a less affluent part of town to avoid construction. We had stopped at a red light next to a rundown diner, the kind with flickering neon signs and grease stains on the windows. I had looked out the window idly, watching the people inside. And then I saw her, Tiffany. She was wearing a polyester uniform that was 2 sizes too big, the color of bruised mustard. Her hair, once her crowning glory of expensive extensions and highlights, was pulled back in a messy hairnet. She was wiping down a table, scrubbing at a stubborn stain with a gray rag. A customer, a large man in trucker hat, was shouting something at her, pointing at his coffee cup. I watched my sister, the girl who used to throw tantrums if her latte wasn't the right temperature, bow her head and apologize. I watched her scurry back to the kitchen, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She looked tired. She looked old. She looked exactly like the nobody she had always been terrified of becoming. I didn't roll down the window. I didn't tell the driver to stop. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive glee, nor did I feel a pang of sisterly guilt. I felt nothing. It was simply a fact of life, like gravity. If you jump off a cliff expecting the world to catch you, you will hit the ground. Tiffany had jumped. Now she was learning how hard the pavement really was. Thinking of her now standing on the balcony of the mansion she had so desperately wanted to inherit, I realized that the universe has a sense of humor. She wanted to be famous. Now she was infamous. She wanted to be served. Now she was serving. "Penny, for your thoughts," Julian asked, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. He rested his chin on my shoulder, looking out at the city lights with me. "I was just thinking about archives," I said softly. "Archives?" he asked. "For years I was the archivist," I said. "I spent my life cataloging other people's history, preserving my grandmother's achievements, hiding my father's mistakes, keeping the record straight while everyone else tried to rewrite it." I turned in his arms to face him. "They used to make fun of my job. They said I was living in the past, but they didn't understand what an archivist actually does." "What do they do?" Julian asked, brushing a stray hair from my face. "We decide what gets saved," I said. "And we decide what gets thrown away." I looked back toward the glass doors where the party was in full swing. I could see the portrait of my father that used to hang in the hallway. It was gone now, replaced by a modern, abstract piece I had chosen. Reginald Brooks had been deaccessioned. He was currently sitting in a memory care facility 2 hours away, asking nurses if they had seen his stock portfolio. He was safe, he was fed, and he was completely irrelevant. Brad was sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial. His history was now being written in court transcripts and prison logs, and Tiffany was writing her own story, one burger order at a time. "I have curated my life, Julian," I whispered. "I have removed the rot. I have restored the foundation." "And you built something magnificent," Julian said, kissing me. "You are not the archivist anymore, Simone. Look at them." He gestured to the room behind us. "You are the Queen of Atlanta." I leaned back against the stone railing, feeling the cool support of the house that was finally truly mine. I thought about the frightened woman who had walked out of her father's house in the rain, with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. I wished I could go back and tell her that it was going to be okay. I wished I could tell her that the rain was just washing away the dirt so she could shine. But she didn't need me to tell her. She had found her own way. She had found the steel in her spine. I looked at Julian, the man who had given me the weapon but let me pull the trigger myself. "They told me that blood was thicker than water," I said, looking into his eyes. "They told me that family was everything, that I had to endure their abuse because we shared a last name. They used loyalty as a chain to choke me." I took a sip of my champagne, the bubbles dancing on my tongue. "But I learned the truth," I continued. "Loyalty isn't something you are born with. It is something you earn. It is a currency. And my family, they went bankrupt a long time ago." Julian smiled, raising his glass. "To the new empire," he said. "To the price of loyalty," I replied. I drained the glass and set it down on the ledge. I took my husband's hand and turned back toward the light, toward the music, toward the future that belonged only to me. They said I was the one who would end up with nothing. But standing here on top of the world, I realized the math was simple. The price to betray me was everything they had. And I had collected every single penny. I smoothed my emerald dress, lifted my chin, and walked back into the party. The archivist was gone. Long live the Queen. The most painful, yet liberating lesson I learned is that shared blood does not guarantee loyalty. For years, I allowed my family to weaponize my desire for love against me, believing that endurance was a form of devotion. But I realized that true family isn't about who you share history with. It's about who stands beside you when the storm comes. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop fighting for people who only fight against you and start building a life where you are finally the queen of your own story. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your peace? Tell me your experience in the comments below. If this story of justice satisfied you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more.